I work at a small 24-hour convenience store on the outskirts of town. Most of the time, my shifts are uneventful, just a few late-night customers and hours of solitude as I stock shelves and clean up. I was used to being alone and I didn't mind. That's why, when my coworker asked to switch shifts so he could attend a family event, I agreed without hesitation. That Friday night started like any other. It was just past 11 p.m. when I locked the front door to focus on the usual tasks. The store had been quiet all day and I doubted anyone else would show up. The sound of the rainstorm outside was the only noise keeping me company. Around midnight, I began stocking shelves in the far left aisle, humming softly to myself to break the monotony. Suddenly, a faint ding echoed through the store, the chime of the front door opening. I froze. The door should have been locked. "Hello?" I called out, stepping cautiously toward the front. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, but the store was empty. The glass doors remained shut, the rain outside streaming down their surface. For a moment I thought I imagined it, but the sound was unmistakable. My fingers brushed against the keys in my pocket and I double-checked the lock. It was still engaged. Brushing off the unease, I returned to stocking shelves. Maybe the sensor had glitched. It wasn't the first time the store's outdated equipment had acted up. I focused on my work, deliberately ignoring the nagging feeling that someone might be watching. Minutes later, as I rolled my cart toward the next aisle, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of faint footsteps, muffled but deliberate. My heart raced as I scanned the store. The aisles stretched long and empty, and I couldn't see anything unusual. I decided to check the security cameras in the office. The small, dusty room felt claustrophobic as I turned on the monitors. The grainy footage flickered to life, showing every corner of the store. At first glance, everything seemed normal. I flipped through the camera angles quickly, but something on the screen made me pause. In the reflection of the cooler doors in the far right aisle, there was a shadow, a figure that wasn't there moments ago. I stood frozen, staring at the monitor. The shadow moved slightly and then it was gone. My breath hitched. Forcing myself to calm down, I told myself it could have been a trick of the light or my own paranoia. Still, I grabbed a flashlight before heading back out into the store. The aisles were eerily quiet. The hum of the refrigerators felt deafening now, filling the silence with static-like noise. I walked slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the shelves. As I reached the end of the far right aisle, my heart nearly stopped. The glass door of one of the coolers was fogged over, streaked with something that looked like smudged handprints. I hadn't seen them earlier. The rest of the coolers were clear, but this one stood out like a warning. I shined the flashlight toward the back of the cooler, half expecting to see someone crouching there. But it was empty. The air around me felt heavy, and I decided it was best to stay near the front of the store until my shift ended. I turned off the aisle lights as I went, trying to create a sense of closure to the strange events of the night. By 2 a.m., I was back at the counter, scrolling aimlessly on my phone to pass the time. That's when I heard it, a loud thud like something heavy falling. My head snapped up. The sound had come from the back of the store. I debated whether to investigate, but the cameras had shown no one else in the building. It had to be nothing, right? Gripping the flashlight tightly, I made my way back to the storage area. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud against the tile floor. The back room was cluttered with boxes and supplies, but nothing seemed out of place. I turned to leave when I noticed something on the floor near the far corner, a small porcelain figurine. It was one of the decorations we kept on the front counter, but I had no idea how it ended up here. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The surface was cold, almost icy to the touch. As I turned to head back to the counter, a faint whisper made me freeze in place. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like it came from the aisle behind me. My flashlight flickered once before steadying, and when I swung the beam toward the sound, there was nothing there. I ran. I didn't care about the store or the shift anymore. I sprinted to the front, grabbing my phone and my bag before unlocking the door and bolting outside. The rain hit my face like needles, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine and driving away. The next morning, I returned to the store with my manager. I explained everything, though I could tell she didn't believe me. Together, we reviewed the security footage, and what we found left us both speechless. The cameras captured the cooler door slowly creaking open, though no one was there to touch it. A faint shadow moved across the back aisle, pausing briefly near the storage room. But the most chilling part was the figurine. It appeared to float off the counter and land softly in the back room, as if guided by invisible hands. I quit my job that day. Whatever was in that store, I wanted no part of it. To this day, I can't walk into a convenience store without feeling a prickle of unease, as if something is watching from just beyond the shelves. I was a college student just starting my second year, and money was tight. When I found a listing for a cheap, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, it seemed perfect. The building was old and a bit run down, but I convinced myself that the low rent was worth the creaky floors and faint smell of mildew. The landlord was an older man who didn't say much beyond the essentials. As he handed me the keys, he casually mentioned that the unit above mine was vacant. "Has been for months," he said. That seemed like a bonus. No noisy neighbors. For the first week, everything was fine. My days were filled with classes, part-time work, and studying, and my nights were quiet. But by the second week, I began hearing faint noises at night. It started as a soft creak, like old wood bending underfoot, but it always came from the ceiling, directly above me. I reminded myself that old buildings make noises, and I tried to ignore it. But over the next few days, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unnervingly heavy. They would start in the far corner of the ceiling and move toward the center, sometimes stopping directly above my bed. Every time I worked up the courage to investigate, I found nothing unusual. The unit above was supposed to be empty. One night, as I was finishing an essay on my laptop, I heard a loud thud above me, followed by a dragging sound. My hands froze over the keyboard. It sounded as though something, or someone, was moving furniture. I stared at the ceiling, my heart racing. Finally, I grabbed my phone and texted the landlord. "Are you sure no one lives upstairs? I keep hearing noises." His response came quickly. "The upstairs unit is empty. No one has lived there since last year. Probably just the pipes." I wanted to believe him, but the noises didn't feel random or mechanical. They felt purposeful, like someone pacing the floor. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the footsteps. Eventually, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see for myself. The next morning, after my landlord left for the day, I went upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls covered in faded wallpaper that curled at the edges. The door to the upstairs unit stood at the end, its paint chipped and flaking. I hesitated, then turned the handle. To my relief and my confusion, it was locked. I peered through the small window next to the door, pressing my face against the glass. The apartment inside looked empty. Dust-covered floors, an old couch in the corner, and no sign of life. I left feeling both relieved and unsettled. If the apartment was empty, what had I been hearing? That night, the noises returned. Louder this time. The footsteps moved faster, almost frantically, and then stopped abruptly. I stared at the ceiling, clutching my blanket, afraid to move. A cold draft brushed across my face, and I realized the air vent above my bed was open. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, but something about the open vent felt wrong. I pushed my desk chair beneath it and climbed up to get a closer look. As I peered into the vent, my heart stopped. Two faint glints of light stared back at me. I screamed and fell backward, landing hard on the floor. My head swam, and my breathing was ragged as I scrambled to my feet. The glints of light disappeared, and I heard a rustling sound inside the vent. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, but mine was shaking as I described what I'd seen. She told me to leave the apartment immediately and wait for the police outside. I grabbed my jacket and ran, not even stopping to put on shoes. The cold night air stung my face as I waited on the curb, glancing nervously at the darkened windows of my building. The police arrived quickly, 2 officers climbing the stairs while I waited outside. It felt like an eternity before they came back down. One of them looked pale as he approached me. "We found evidence of someone living in the attic above the building," he said. "There's a crawl space that connects to the air ducts. It looks like they've been accessing your apartment through the vent." My stomach turned. Who was it?" The officer shook his head. "We didn't find anyone, but they left in a hurry. There were sleeping bags, food wrappers, and even a few personal belongings. We'll need to investigate further." They showed me what they'd found: a pile of trash, a makeshift bed, and, most disturbingly, a collection of small items that I recognized as mine. A pen, a hair tie, a pair of socks I thought I'd misplaced. The landlord was horrified. He promised to secure the building and offered to let me break my lease without penalty. I moved out the next day, leaving behind anything I couldn't carry. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from that vent for weeks, maybe even longer. The thought of those eyes staring down at me as I slept still haunts my dreams. I'll never look at an empty apartment or an air vent the same way again. Working late shifts at the shopping mall had become routine for me. I worked in one of the smaller clothing stores, tucked away in a quieter wing of the building. Most nights, I left after closing up at 10 p.m., walking to the employee parking lot alone. It wasn't exactly the safest setup, but it was what it was. That night started like any other. By the time I locked up and stepped outside, the mall was silent, and the air carried a chill. The employee parking lot was dimly lit, with only a few flickering streetlights scattered across the vast expanse. My car was parked in the far corner, one of the only vehicles left. As I approached my car, something on the ground caught my eye. Cigarette butts, at least 5 of them, lay scattered right next to the driver's side door. I frowned. I didn't smoke, and as far as I knew, none of my coworkers did either. The sight unsettled me, but I brushed it off as coincidence. Maybe someone had taken a smoke break near my car earlier. Unlocking the door, I climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors immediately out of habit. The parking lot was eerily quiet, save for the hum of distant traffic. My headlights illuminated the rows of empty spaces ahead, casting long, distorted shadows. Just as I was about to pull out, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror, a shadow darting between cars. My heart skipped a beat. I craned my neck, squinting into the darkness, but saw nothing. My pulse quickened as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're being paranoid," I muttered to myself. It was probably a stray animal or a trick of the light. Forcing myself to breathe evenly, I shifted into reverse and drove toward the exit. As I turned onto the main road, my nerves began to settle. But then, in the corner of my eye, I noticed headlights. A dark sedan had pulled out of the lot just after me. It followed at a steady distance, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was a public parking lot after all, and someone leaving at the same time wasn't unusual. But as I continued driving, the sedan stayed with me, turning at every intersection, mirroring my route. My stomach tightened. Was I imagining this, or was someone actually following me? To test my suspicion, I made an unnecessary turn onto a quieter street. The sedan followed. I sped up, taking another sharp turn. The car stayed right behind me, its headlights uncomfortably close now. A chill ran down my spine. My neighborhood was only a few minutes away, but I didn't want to lead this person to my house. Instead, I turned into a well-lit gas station and parked near the entrance. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching the sedan as it passed by and disappeared down the road. Relief flooded over me. Maybe it was all a coincidence. After waiting a few minutes, I decided to head home. The streets were empty, and I reached my driveway without incident. My small house was dark, save for the faint glow of the porch light. As I stepped out of the car, the night seemed unnaturally still. I hurried to unlock the door and slipped inside, locking it behind me. I had just started to relax when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. My body tensed. Who would be knocking at this hour? Slowly, I approached the door and peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. I backed away, my heart racing. The knock came again, louder this time. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be the driver of the sedan? Or was it just a prank? Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice guided me as I explained the situation. She assured me that officers were on their way. I stayed on the line, retreating to the back of the house, far from the door. Minutes later, I heard another sound, faint but distinct, the crunch of gravel from the side of the house. I crept toward the back window, my hand trembling as I lifted the curtain. My breath caught in my throat. A figure stood by my car. They were dressed in dark clothing, a hood obscuring their face. In their hand, they held something long and metallic, a crowbar or pipe. My heart pounded as I whispered into the phone, describing what I saw to the operator. The figure moved toward the house, disappearing from my view. My entire body went cold as I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside the back door. I gripped the phone tighter, praying the police would arrive soon. Just as I felt panic beginning to overwhelm me, red and blue lights illuminated the street. The sound of sirens cut through the silence, and within seconds, 2 police cars screeched to a stop in front of my house. The footsteps outside stopped abruptly, and I heard the crunch of gravel as the figure ran. The officers gave chase, and moments later they returned with a man in handcuffs. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and wild eyes. In his pocket they found a knife. One of the officers explained that the man had been spotted loitering near the mall earlier in the evening. It appeared he'd been waiting for a vulnerable target to follow. My stomach turned as I realized how close I'd come to being that target. The police advised me to install security cameras and be cautious in the future. That night, I barely slept, replaying the events over and over in my mind. Every creak of the house sent my heart racing, and the thought of what could have happened haunted me. To this day, I'm extra vigilant when leaving work or walking to my car. The memory of that shadow in the parking lot and the figure by my car is a constant reminder to never ignore my instincts. The world can be a terrifying place, especially in the quiet moments when you think you're alone. Last summer, I rented a small lake house to escape the chaos of city life. It was the perfect retreat, isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and perched right on the edge of a still, reflective lake. The closest town was a 20-minute drive away, and there wasn't another house in sight. It was exactly what I needed to clear my mind and focus on my writing. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my mornings hiking the nearby trails and my evenings sitting on the deck, listening to the soft rustle of the trees and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. At night, the only light came from the moon and stars, their reflection shimmering on the lake's surface. On the third night, as I sat on the deck watching the water, I noticed something odd. Across the lake, in a small clearing on the opposite shore, a faint flicker of light appeared. It was steady like a lantern or a campfire. I hadn't seen anyone over there during my hikes, and I was sure there weren't any roads or trails that led to that side. The light didn't move, and I convinced myself it was probably just some campers enjoying the wilderness. Still, the thought of someone else out there, so close yet unseen, made me uneasy. I went inside and locked the doors before heading to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping, but as I lay there in the dark, it grew louder. It was coming from the direction of the lake. I crept to the window and peered out, my breath fogging up the glass. The clearing across the lake was dark now, the light gone. But on the shore, just a few feet from the deck, I saw something, or someone. A tall figure stood there, facing the water, motionless. The moonlight cast a pale glow over their silhouette, but I couldn't make out any details. My heart pounded as I watched, waiting for them to move, to do something. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure turned and walked into the lake. The water rippled around them, swallowing their form until they disappeared beneath the surface. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. Who was that? And why had they been standing so close to the house? I wanted to call someone, but my phone had no signal and the landline was dead. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light or my tired mind playing tricks on me, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to check the area by the shore where I had seen the figure. I hoped I wouldn't find anything, that the stillness of the lake would reassure me. Instead, I found footprints. They were large, deep impressions in the mud, leading from the edge of the woods to the water. They stopped abruptly at the shore, as if the person had vanished into thin air. My stomach churned as I stared at the prints. I had no explanation, no rational way to process what I was seeing. I spent the day trying to focus on my writing, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure walking into the lake. By evening, the sun began to set, and the familiar quiet of the woods settled in. I sat on the deck again, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting to the far shore, half expecting the light to reappear. At around 10 p.m. it did. A faint, flickering glow, steady and unchanging. This time I didn't wait. Grabbing a flashlight, I decided to drive into town. I needed to get away, even if just for a few hours. As I walked toward my car, I heard it again, the tapping sound. It was louder now, sharper, and it was coming from the direction of the house. I turned, shining the flashlight toward the deck. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was back, standing on the deck this time, their outline sharp against the darkness. They were still, but I could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I called out, my voice cracking. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't move. They didn't speak. And then, slowly, they raised an arm and pointed toward the lake. Panic surged through me and I bolted for the car. I jumped in, locking the doors and fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I reached the nearest gas station, a small, dimly lit place on the edge of town. The attendant looked startled when I burst inside, pale and shaking. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words jumbled together in my panic. He nodded slowly and said, "You're not the first person to say something like that. That lake's got stories." I stayed at a motel that night, unable to bring myself to return to the house. The next morning, I drove back to collect my belongings, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door. The house was silent, the lake calm. But as I packed, I noticed something on the deck, a single wet footprint larger than my own, leading toward the door. I didn't stay to see where it went. I left everything else behind and never looked back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw at the lake house. All I know is that some places are better left undisturbed, their secrets hidden beneath the surface. I moved into a quiet suburban house a few months ago. It was an old but cozy place with a small yard and a line of trees separating it from the neighbors. The previous owner had lived there for decades, and while the house had its quirks, creaky floors and occasionally sticky windows, it felt like home almost immediately. Things started off uneventfully. My days were spent working from home, and my evenings were quiet, often accompanied by the soft hum of the TV in the background. It wasn't until the second month that I noticed something odd. One morning as I was taking out the trash, I saw a garbage bag torn open in my backyard. Trash was scattered across the grass, but what unsettled me was that it didn't look like the work of animals. The bag had been cleanly cut open, and none of the contents looked like they had been chewed or clawed. I figured it was just some local kids playing pranks, cleaned it up, and forgot about it. But over the next week, more bags ended up ripped open in the same way. I decided to set up a cheap motion-activated camera on my back porch to catch whoever was messing with my trash. The first few nights, the camera didn't pick up much. A few stray cats wandered through, and the trees swayed eerily in the wind, but nothing unusual happened. Then, on the fourth night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint tapping sound. I lay still, straining to hear, and realized it was coming from the window in my living room. Heart racing, I got out of bed and crept toward the noise. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone gently knocking with their knuckles. My living room was dark, the curtains drawn, but the dim glow of the street lights outside faintly illuminated the window. I peered through a small gap in the curtain, and my breath caught in my throat. A figure was standing outside just a few feet away from the glass. They were tall and motionless, their face obscured by shadows. My stomach dropped as I realized they weren't moving, not even breathing. They just stood there staring at the window. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What if it was just a drunk neighbor who'd wandered into the wrong yard? Before I could decide, the tapping stopped. When I worked up the courage to peek through the curtain again, the figure was gone. The next morning, I checked the footage from the camera. My fingers trembled as I fast-forwarded through hours of nothing. But then, at 2:58 a.m., the camera captured something. A man emerged from the tree line at the edge of my yard. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, as he approached the house. He stopped at the back window, standing there for several minutes without moving. Then, just before he turned to leave, he did something that made my blood run cold. He looked directly into the camera and smiled. I called the police immediately and showed them the footage. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised me to keep my doors and windows locked at all times. That night, I triple-checked every lock in the house before going to bed. For a while, nothing happened. A week passed, then two, and I began to relax. I convinced myself that it had been a random incident, maybe just someone trying to scare me. But one night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was at the window in my bedroom. I froze, toothbrush still in hand, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but the tapping was unmistakable. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost mocking. Gripping my phone, I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator, explaining what was happening. As I spoke, the tapping stopped. I stayed on the line, clutching the phone tightly as I inched toward the window. Against my better judgment, I pulled the curtain back slightly and peeked outside. The figure was there again, standing closer this time, their face partially illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. It was a man, his face pale and expressionless. He tilted his head slightly as if studying me, and then raised his hand to wave. I dropped the curtain and backed away, trembling. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across my yard. They searched the area but found no one. The officer who spoke to me tried to reassure me, but his tone suggested he thought I was overreacting. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind set my nerves on edge. Then one morning, I woke up to find something chilling on my front porch. A torn piece of paper with the words, "Nice to see you," scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. I packed my things that day and moved out, breaking my lease without caring about the financial consequences. Whatever was happening in that house, I wanted no part of it. I've since moved to a new city, far away from that quiet suburban neighborhood. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint tapping sounds, and I can't help but glance toward the window, dreading what I might see staring back at me. A few months ago, I decided to take a much-needed break from city life. I found a listing for a small mountain cabin that seemed perfect for a weekend getaway. It was secluded, surrounded by towering trees and rolling hills, with a breathtaking view of the valley below. The thought of a quiet weekend away from my phone, emails, and people sounded like heaven. I invited my best friend Alex to join me, but the night before we were supposed to leave, he canceled due to a work emergency. I considered postponing the trip but ultimately decided to go alone. The idea of some solitude was still appealing, and I had already paid for the rental. The drive up was uneventful, and I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It was exactly as advertised, a cozy rustic wooden structure perched on a small clearing at the edge of the forest. The air smelled crisp, the silence broken only by the occasional chirping of birds. I settled in quickly, lighting the fireplace and unpacking my things. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin grew eerily quiet. I switched on a few lamps and made myself a quick dinner, enjoying the peaceful isolation. By 10 p.m. I was curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me, reading a book. That's when I heard it, the faint crunch of gravel outside. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I strained my ears, hoping I had imagined it, but there it was again, a slow, deliberate sound as if someone was walking around the cabin. My mind raced. It was a remote area with no other cabins or homes nearby. I reminded myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen counter, I cautiously approached the window. The beam of light swept across the yard, illuminating the tall trees and the dirt driveway. Nothing moved. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the gentle breeze. After a few minutes of watching, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night I struggled to sleep. Every creak of the wooden cabin and rustle of the wind outside made me jump. At around 2 a.m. I woke up to a loud thud. It sounded like it came from the back of the cabin. My heart raced as I sat up, gripping the blanket tightly. I listened intently. The sound came again, this time closer, like something heavy being dragged across the porch. Summoning my courage, I tiptoed to the living room and peered out the front window. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, in the faint moonlight, I noticed a shadow moving near the edge of the forest. It wasn't an animal. The shadow was tall, unmistakably human. Whoever it was seemed to be carrying something long and heavy. My throat tightened as I realized they were heading toward the cabin. I quickly locked all the windows and double-checked the front door, making sure the deadbolt was secure. The old cabin suddenly felt incredibly fragile, its thin walls offering little protection. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but froze when I saw the no-signal message glaring back at me. The shadowy figure disappeared from view, and the cabin fell silent again. I stood in the center of the living room, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. A faint tapping sound broke the silence, coming from one of the side windows. My blood ran cold. The tapping grew louder and more insistent, moving from one window to the next, as if whoever was outside was testing them. I didn't dare move, my breath shallow and quick. Then suddenly it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard the distinct sound of the back door handle rattling. My heart pounded as I realized they were trying to get in. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal candlestick, and positioned myself behind the couch, ready to defend myself if needed. The handle rattled again, harder this time, followed by a sharp crack as if someone was trying to force the door open. Panic took over, and I let out a shaky shout. "I've called the police. They're on their way." The noise stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stayed crouched behind the couch, clutching the candlestick, too afraid to move. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, my eyes fixed on the back door. Finally, I heard footsteps retreating, moving away from the cabin. I didn't dare look out the windows to confirm, terrified they might still be out there, waiting. When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight brought a small sense of relief. I cautiously opened the front door and stepped outside. The yard was empty, but as I walked around to the back, I saw clear signs of what had happened. The back door handle was bent, and the wood around it was splintered. Deep footprints were pressed into the dirt, leading from the porch to the tree line. I packed my things in record time, leaving the cabin long before my scheduled checkout. On the drive down the mountain, I passed a lone park ranger and flagged him down to report what had happened. He listened carefully, nodding, but his response sent a shiver down my spine. "You're lucky," he said. "We've had reports of a man lurking around the cabins in this area. He's been breaking in and stealing supplies, or worse. You're not the first person to see him." I never went back to that cabin. The memory of that night still haunts me, and I can't shake the image of the shadowy figure moving through the trees. What would have happened if he had managed to break in? I don't want to know. I was driving alone on a chilly autumn evening, heading to a small town where I was meeting some friends for the weekend. My GPS estimated I'd arrive by 9 p.m., leaving plenty of time to settle in and relax. The drive was peaceful, the road surrounded by forests and fields, the occasional farmhouse breaking the monotony. About halfway there, my GPS beeped, alerting me to a route change. Faster route available, the screen displayed. I glanced at the suggested turn, a narrow, winding road branching off from the highway. It wasn't the route I'd planned, but I figured shaving a few minutes off the drive couldn't hurt. The road was narrower than I expected, barely wide enough for 2 cars, and lined with tall trees that blocked out the fading sunlight. My headlights carved a path through the growing darkness, illuminating nothing but endless stretches of asphalt and dense woods. After a few minutes, I noticed something strange. The GPS screen displayed the new route, but the landmarks it mentioned didn't match what I was seeing. Instead of the small towns and gas stations I'd been expecting, the road seemed completely isolated. The signal on my phone had also vanished, leaving me with only the eerie glow of the GPS screen for company. I told myself it was just an outdated map or a glitch in the system. I kept driving, the road winding deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. There were no street lights, no houses, not even another car. Then I passed something odd, a wooden sign on the side of the road. Its paint was faded and the letters were barely legible, but I managed to make out the words, "Welcome back." I slowed down, my pulse quickening. Welcome back. I'd never been here before. My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I glanced at the GPS. The estimated arrival time had disappeared, replaced with a single word, "Continue." I stopped the car, pulling over to the side of the road. Something didn't feel right. I turned off the GPS, hoping to reset it, but the screen remained blank. I tried my phone next, but it still had no signal. My car felt like the only thing tethering me to safety, and I debated turning around and retracing my steps. Before I could decide, my headlights caught movement ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move, just stood there, illuminated by the beams of my headlights. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a man, his shoulders hunched and his head slightly tilted. I honked the horn, hoping he'd step aside. Instead, he raised an arm and pointed, not at me, but toward the woods on the side of the road. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I shifted the car into reverse, my tires skidding slightly on the gravel as I backed away. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind me was no longer empty. 2 more figures stood there, their shapes barely visible in the shadows. Panic surged through me. I slammed the car into drive and sped forward, swerving around the figure in the road. My tires kicked up dirt as I raced down the narrow path, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches arching overhead like claws. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a light ahead, a faint, flickering glow. Relief washed over me as I realized it was a small gas station. I pulled into the lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. The station looked deserted, its single pump covered in rust and its windows dark. I got out of the car cautiously, my legs trembling beneath me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. The station felt abandoned, as if it hadn't been used in years. But something about it seemed oddly familiar, though I couldn't place why. I turned to get back in my car, only to find the figures from the road standing at the edge of the lot. There were 3 of them now, their silhouettes still and silent. I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the figures. They were closer now, their faces still obscured, but I could feel their gaze fixed on me. I hit the gas, speeding out of the lot and back onto the road. The GPS suddenly flickered back on, its screen displaying a new message: turn left. I hesitated but followed the instruction, too terrified to do anything else. The road twisted and turned, and eventually the trees thinned, giving way to open fields. Lights appeared in the distance, buildings, roads, and the familiar layout of a small town. When I finally reached the main road, my phone buzzed to life, displaying a flood of missed messages and notifications. I pulled into the nearest diner, my body trembling as I tried to catch my breath. Inside, the waitress gave me a concerned look as she poured me a cup of coffee. "You okay, hon? You look like you've seen a ghost." I nodded, unsure of how to explain what had happened. As I stared at the steaming cup in front of me, I realized something chilling. The gas station, the one I had stopped at, it had been in my hometown. I hadn't been there in years, but I knew it had burned down over a decade ago. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen on that road. To this day, I avoid shortcuts and always double-check my GPS. Some routes aren't meant to be taken, and some places, once left behind, should never be revisited. I was on my way home late one evening when I realized I was out of a few essentials: milk, bread, and batteries for my flashlight. There was a self-service convenience store just a few blocks from my apartment, one of those fully automated ones where you scan your items, pay at a kiosk, and let yourself out. It was always quiet, especially late at night, which was exactly what I needed after a long day at work. The store was empty when I arrived, as I expected. Its bright fluorescent lights flickered slightly, giving the place an odd, almost sterile atmosphere. The sliding doors opened with a soft hiss, and the cool air inside wrapped around me like a whisper. I grabbed a basket and started picking up what I needed, enjoying the quiet. The sound of my footsteps echoed faintly in the aisles, the only noise in the entire store. As I turned the corner toward the batteries, I noticed something strange. One of the shelves had several items knocked over, cans and boxes scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. I frowned, bending down to pick them up. This place was supposed to be self-cleaning, with robotic carts and sensors that restock and tidy up automatically. It was odd that the system hadn't taken care of the mess, but I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a glitch. As I walked toward the kiosk to check out, a low mechanical hum filled the air. I assumed it was one of the cleaning robots starting up. But when I looked around, I didn't see anything moving. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor, and the lights began to flicker more violently. Then, without warning, the entire store plunged into darkness. I froze, clutching the basket in my hands. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling silence. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to cut through the darkness. The shelves around me loomed like shadowy walls, their edges sharp and imposing. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. There was no one here to answer. Or at least there shouldn't have been. As I made my way toward the exit, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The sliding doors were shut tight, their glowing exit sign now completely dark. I waved my hand in front of the sensor, but nothing happened. I tried pushing the doors manually, but they didn't budge. I was trapped. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced at the screen, hoping it was a notification or a message. Instead, it was a system alert. Emergency lock engaged. Please remain calm. Remain calm? My pulse quickened as I looked around the store, searching for an emergency exit or any sign of a way out. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping sound coming from the back of the store. It was soft at first, almost like dripping water, but it grew louder with each passing second. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped abruptly. I took a deep breath and decided to investigate. My phone's flashlight wavered as I walked toward the sound, my footsteps feeling unnaturally loud. When I reached the back aisle, I found nothing but rows of neatly stacked products. No drips, no leaks, no sign of what had caused the noise. Then I heard it again, this time directly behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating empty space. My breath hitched as I noticed something on the floor. Footprints. They weren't mine. These prints were larger, smeared slightly as if whoever made them had been dragging their feet. They led from the center of the store to the aisle where I stood, but they stopped abruptly as if the person had vanished into thin air. I backed away slowly, the basket slipping from my hands. A faint noise echoed through the store, like static from a distant radio. It was coming from the speaker system overhead, but instead of the usual announcements or music, it was garbled, nonsensical whispers. Leave, stay, never. The words were fragmented, overlapping, and barely audible, but their tone sent chills down my spine. I turned and sprinted toward the kiosk, desperate to pay and get out. My fingers trembled as I scanned each item, the beeps of the scanner feeling deafening in the suffocating silence. The receipt printed, but the door still didn't open. I banged on the glass, shouting for help, but the sound only echoed back at me. The whispers from the speakers grew louder, turning into something that sounded almost like laughter, low, guttural, and mocking. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the whispers stopped. Relief flooded through me as I saw the doors slide open with their familiar hiss. Grabbing my bag, I bolted outside without looking back. The cool night air felt like a lifeline as I ran down the street, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, struggling to catch my breath. My phone buzzed again and I hesitated before looking at the screen. It was another system alert from the store. Thank you for shopping. We hope to see you again soon. I never went back to that convenience store. Whatever had happened that night, I didn't want to understand it. But sometimes when I walk past it on my way home, I glance at its bright, inviting lights and wonder if anyone else has been trapped inside, and whether they made it out. A few months ago, my friend Dylan and I decided to go camping in a remote national park. Dylan was an avid outdoorsman, and while I was less experienced, the idea of a weekend surrounded by nature sounded appealing. We chose a spot deep in the forest, far from any established campsites, to truly get away from the world. The first day was perfect. We hiked through dense woods, crossing small streams and admiring the towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. By late afternoon, we found a clearing to set up camp. Dylan pitched the tent while I gathered firewood. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. As night fell, we lit a campfire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The stars above were dazzling, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. Around 11 p.m., the fire began to die down, and we decided to call it a night. Crawling into the tent, we zipped ourselves in and drifted off to the soothing sounds of the forest. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a strange noise outside. It was faint at first, like the crunch of leaves underfoot, but it grew louder, circling the tent. My heart raced as I listened intently, trying to figure out what it was. Dylan stirred beside me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned, still half asleep. "Probably just an animal. Go back to sleep." But it didn't sound like an animal. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't wandering aimlessly. It was pacing around the tent, stopping every few seconds before resuming its slow, deliberate movements. "Dylan," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Something's out there." This time he sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the campsite. Dylan grabbed the flashlight from his backpack and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The clearing was empty, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. "See? Nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Reluctantly, I lay back down, though sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, we found something strange near the edge of our campsite. Deep in the dirt were footprints, human footprints, barefoot and larger than either of ours. They circled the tent several times before disappearing into the woods. My stomach churned as I stared at them. "Maybe it's just some local messing with us," Dylan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We decided to stay one more night, reasoning that we'd come too far to leave early over a few spooky noises. We spent the day exploring the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The forest, once serene, now felt oppressive, its towering trees like silent sentinels. That night, we kept the fire burning longer than usual, hoping it would deter whatever, or whoever, had been circling our camp. Around midnight, the fire began to die down, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. Dylan and I sat in uneasy silence, the weight of the previous night hanging over us. Then we heard it. The footsteps were back, slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the light of the fire. Dylan grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the woods, but the beam revealed only trees and darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. There was no response, just the sound of footsteps circling closer. My pulse quickened as I scanned the shadows, straining to see. Then from the darkness, a low, guttural laugh broke the silence. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. "Let's pack up and leave," I whispered, my voice trembling. Dylan nodded, and we hurriedly began to gather our things. The laughter faded, replaced by the sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching. It was no longer just footsteps. Whatever was out there was moving quickly, darting through the trees. We didn't bother taking down the tent. Grabbing our essentials, we stuffed them into our backpacks and doused the fire. The clearing fell into darkness, and the sounds in the woods grew louder, closer. My hands shook as I gripped my flashlight, the beam flickering as I fumbled with the switch. "Let's go," Dylan said, his voice low and urgent. We started down the trail, our flashlights casting shaky beams ahead of us. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows shifting just beyond our vision. Every few steps, I'd hear the crunch of leaves behind us, matching our pace. "Don't look back," Dylan said, as much to himself as to me. The trail felt endless, the trees pressing in from all sides. My lungs burned as we pushed forward, my legs aching with every step. Then, just as the trail began to slope upward, my flashlight caught something on a tree ahead. Carved into the bark was a symbol, a crude, jagged spiral surrounded by smaller, claw-like marks. It was fresh, the edges of the carving still raw. I stopped, my heart pounding in my ears. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Dylan didn't answer. He grabbed my arm and pulled me forward, his face pale in the dim light. "Keep moving." We didn't stop until we reached the car, our breaths ragged and our clothes damp with sweat. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the trees. But the road remained empty, the dark woods swallowing the light of our taillights. We never spoke about what happened that night. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I hear the faint crunch of leaves outside my window and wonder if whatever was in those woods that night followed us home. A few months ago, I found myself in desperate need of a place to stay. My lease was ending and I couldn't afford most of the apartments in my city. After exhausting all other options, I turned to Craigslist. It wasn't ideal, but I figured I could find a cheap room to rent while I got back on my feet. After a few hours of searching, I came across an ad that caught my eye. It was for a room in a large, old house on the outskirts of town. The rent was incredibly low, almost suspiciously so, but the picture showed a clean, spacious room with a large window overlooking the backyard. I called the number listed, and the landlord, a man named Mr. Hayes, answered almost immediately. His voice was deep and calm, and he sounded eager to rent out the room. He told me the house was quiet, with just a few other tenants who mostly kept to themselves. When I asked why the rent was so low, he simply said, "I'd rather have the room occupied than let it sit empty." The next day I drove out to see the place. The house was older than I expected, with peeling paint and overgrown bushes, but it had a certain charm. Mr. Hayes met me at the door, a tall man in his 60s with a kind smile. He showed me around, and the room looked just like the pictures, clean, bright, and cozy. There was one odd thing, though. As we walked past a door at the end of the hallway, Mr. Hayes quickly stepped in front of it, blocking my view. "This one's locked," he said curtly. "It's just storage. Nothing you need to worry about." I didn't think much of it at the time. The rent was too good to pass up, so I moved in that weekend. For the first few days, everything seemed fine. The house was quiet, almost eerily so, but I didn't mind. I rarely saw the other tenants, and Mr. Hayes kept to himself. It was exactly the peaceful environment I needed. But then, strange things started happening. It began with small noises at night, soft thuds and creaks coming from the direction of the locked door. I assumed it was just the house settling, but the noises seemed too deliberate, too rhythmic. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint whispering. It was so quiet I thought I might be imagining it, but as I lay there, straining to hear, it grew louder. The whispers seemed to come from the hallway right outside my door. I got up, heart pounding, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The only light came from the faint glow of a street lamp outside the window. The whispering had stopped. Feeling foolish, I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to Mr. Hayes. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Old houses make noise," he said, his tone light but dismissive. "You'll get used to it." A few nights later, I came home late after work. The house was dark and silent as usual. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed something strange. The locked door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness spilled out into the hall, and I froze, unsure of what to do. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I approached the door slowly, every instinct telling me to turn back. When I reached it, I pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The room was dimly lit by the glow of a single bare light bulb. The walls were lined with shelves, each one cluttered with strange objects, photographs, trinkets, and what looked like journals. But what caught my attention were the photographs. Dozens of them, pinned to the walls in chaotic clusters. Each one was of a person, young, old, male, female, and they all seemed to be staring directly at the camera. A chill ran down my spine when I realized one of the photos was of me. I backed out of the room, my breathing shallow. As I turned to leave, I bumped into something solid. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with Mr. Hayes. His kind smile was gone, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "You shouldn't be in there," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I am sorry," I stammered, stepping back. "I thought I heard something." "You didn't hear anything," he snapped. "And you'll stay out of this room from now on. Understood?" I nodded quickly and hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I had seen. Who were those people in the photos? And why was my picture among them? That night I barely slept. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. At some point, exhaustion overtook me and I drifted off, only to wake up a few hours later to the sound of footsteps outside my door. They were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just outside. My breath caught as I watched the doorknob twist, the lock holding firm. I didn't move, didn't breathe as the footsteps retreated down the hall. When morning came, I packed my things and left without saying a word to Mr. Hayes. I didn't care about the deposit or the rent I had already paid. A few weeks later, I worked up the courage to look up the address online. What I found made my blood run cold. Several people who had lived in the house over the years had gone missing, their disappearances never solved. The photos in that locked room came rushing back to me, and I wondered if they were somehow connected. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible. I'll never trust another Craigslist ad, and I'll always wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. It had been a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home, kick off my shoes, and collapse onto the couch. But as I approached the front door of my apartment building, I realized I'd forgotten my keys. They were sitting on the kitchen counter, exactly where I'd left them that morning. Cursing my absent-mindedness, I remembered the spare key I'd hidden in the small storage box beside the door. It was meant for emergencies like this. Pulling out the dusty box, I found the spare key still tucked inside. I let out a sigh of relief and unlocked the door, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. Something felt off as I made my way to my apartment on the second floor. The building was always quiet at this hour, but tonight it felt different. The air was heavier, and the faint smell of mildew seemed more pronounced. I chalked it up to my tiredness and climbed the creaky stairs. When I reached my door, I fumbled with the key, eager to get inside. The lock clicked, and I stepped into my apartment, flipping on the light. Everything looked normal. My small living room was just as I'd left it, the faint hum of the refrigerator audible from the kitchen. I tossed my bag onto the couch and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I poured the water, I noticed something strange. One of my shoes, which I always kept neatly by the front door, was lying in the middle of the hallway. I stared at it for a moment, confused. I was certain I hadn't left it there. I shrugged it off, convincing myself I must have knocked it over in my rush that morning. After setting the shoe back in its place, I sank into the couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone until my eyelids grew heavy. At around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. A faint noise had pulled me from my sleep, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound came again, this time louder. It was coming from the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the quiet hum of the fridge. I told myself it was probably just the building settling or a neighbor moving around upstairs. But as I got up to check the hallway, a chill ran down my spine. The shoe I had moved earlier was back in the middle of the floor. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. I hadn't heard anyone enter the apartment, and the door was locked. Slowly, I turned and checked every room, flashlight in hand, but the apartment was empty. Feeling unnerved, I locked the door again, this time sliding the chain into place. I returned to the couch, but sleep was impossible. Every small sound made me jump. Around 3:30 a.m., just as I was beginning to calm down, I heard the faint click of the lock. My blood ran cold. The door was locked. How could it be moving? I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the entryway, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the door, I saw the chain hanging loose, swaying slightly as if it had just been unlatched. The lock was undone. My fingers trembled as I tightened my grip on the knife and swung the door open, but the hallway outside was empty. As I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, something caught my eye. On the floor just outside my door was a key. It wasn't my spare key, nor did it belong to anyone I knew. The metal was dull and tarnished, with faint scratches etched along its surface. I picked it up cautiously, my mind racing. Who had left it there? And how had they unlocked my door? I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called my landlord and explained what had happened. He promised to send someone to change the locks that afternoon. I went to work, hoping to distract myself, but the image of the strange key lingered in my mind. When I returned that evening, the locksmith had already been by. A new lock and deadbolt were installed, and I felt a small sense of relief as I stepped inside. But my relief was short-lived. On the kitchen counter, where I had definitely left nothing, was the tarnished key. It was impossible. I had left the key in my coat pocket, which was locked in my desk at work. My legs felt weak as I stared at it, the scratches on its surface seeming more jagged, more deliberate. That night, I decided to stay at a friend's house. I packed a bag quickly, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it, the faint click of the lock. I didn't turn around. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me and not stopping until I reached the street. The next day I moved out. I didn't go back for my things. The landlord wasn't happy, but I didn't care. Whatever was in that apartment, whatever left that key, I wanted no part of it. A week later, I got a call from the landlord. He was trying to rent the apartment again, but wanted to know if I had left an extra key. "There's a key here," he said, "right in the middle of the floor. The strangest thing is, it doesn't fit the new lock." I hung up without answering. To this day, I keep my doors double locked and never leave a spare key anywhere. Some doors, once opened, are better left closed. It was a rainy Friday night, and I had stayed late at the office finishing up a project. By the time I stepped into the elevator to head to the parking garage, the building was nearly empty. The soft ding of the elevator felt unusually loud against the silence. When I reached the underground parking lot, a chill ran through me. The space was dimly lit, with only a few fluorescent lights flickering intermittently. The rain outside echoed faintly through the concrete walls, accompanied by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. I made my way to my car, the sound of my heels clicking against the concrete the only noise. My car was parked near the farthest corner, where the lights were weakest, casting long, shadowy shapes that danced with every step I took. As I approached my car, I noticed something unusual. A dark puddle had formed next to the driver's side door. At first, I thought it was just water from a leak in the ceiling, but as I got closer, I realized it was thicker, almost oily. I frowned, crouching to take a closer look. That's when I saw them, footprints. The puddle wasn't just a random spill, it was smeared as though someone had stepped in it and then walked away. The prints were large, barefoot, and they led away from my car, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the garage. My chest tightened as I straightened up, scanning the dimly lit space. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. There was no response, just the faint drip of water and the distant rumble of the rain outside. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had wandered in earlier, or maybe the prints were old, the puddle just forming now from the rainwater dripping down. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As the engine roared to life, my headlights flickered on, illuminating the rows of empty spaces ahead. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the garage, just at the edge of the light. They were tall, their features obscured by the shadows, but they were unmistakably staring at me. My stomach dropped. My instinct was to drive away immediately, but something kept me frozen in place, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, their heads slightly tilted as if studying me. Finally, I snapped out of it and threw the car into reverse, backing out of the space quickly. The tires screeched against the wet concrete as I turned toward the exit. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting the figure to still be standing there. But they weren't. Panic surged through me as I scanned the mirror. They had disappeared, the spot where they'd been now empty. I hit the gas, speeding toward the exit ramp. As I rounded the corner to leave the garage, I heard it, a loud bang like something hitting the back of my car. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. "No, no, no," I muttered, my hands shaking. I didn't want to get out of the car. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to face it. But the sound had been so loud I couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I unlocked the door and stepped out, the damp air hitting me like a slap. I walked to the back of the car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was no dent, no sign of anything hitting the car. But on the wet surface of the trunk, I saw a handprint. It was smudged and faint, but it was there. A large, wet handprint. My breath caught in my throat as I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing across the garage. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the empty spaces. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow darted between the cars, too fast for me to make out any details. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed toward my car, keeping the flashlight trained on the rows of vehicles. As I reached for the door handle, the shadow reappeared, this time closer. It was just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, crouched low as if waiting. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My tires squealed as I sped toward the exit, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the street, I drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I parked in front of my apartment and ran inside, locking every door and window behind me. The next morning, I went to check my car in the daylight. There were no signs of damage, no handprints, and no puddle. It was as if nothing had happened. But I can't forget the figure in the garage, the way it stood perfectly still, watching me. I haven't parked there since. Every time I think about it, I wonder, was it just someone messing with me? Or was it something else entirely, something waiting in the shadows of that empty garage? After moving into my new apartment, I spent the first few days unpacking and getting organized. The space was small but cozy, just the right size for one person. As I unpacked, I came across an old family photo album buried at the bottom of a box. I hadn't seen it in years, and flipping through its pages felt like taking a stroll down memory lane. The photos were exactly as I remembered: birthday parties, vacations, candid moments with friends and family. But as I turned the pages, a strange unease began to creep over me. A few photos seemed different. One in particular caught my attention. It was a picture of my family at the park, my mom and dad smiling while I sat on a swing. In the background, under the shade of a tree, stood a figure I didn't recognize. It was blurry, as though they were moving when the picture was taken, but something about their posture felt deliberate. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to remember if anyone else had been at the park that day. It was an old photo, and my memory of the event was hazy at best. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure didn't belong there. Shaking off the unease, I closed the album and went back to unpacking. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, and I went to bed thinking I'd been overanalyzing. The next morning, I decided to take another look at the album, curious about the strange figure in the park photo. But when I opened it, the page with that photo was missing. My heart skipped a beat. I flipped through the album again, checking each page carefully, but it was gone. The other photos were still there, untouched, but the park photo had vanished. I told myself I must have misplaced it. Maybe it had fallen out while I was unpacking. I searched the apartment, but the photo was nowhere to be found. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My thoughts kept drifting back to the missing photo and the shadowy figure. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the faint sound of rustling paper. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a breeze stirring the leaves. But as I lay there, I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. My chest tightened as I sat up, straining to hear. The sound was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone for light and crept toward the door. The apartment was silent now, the rustling stopped. My heart pounded as I stepped into the living room, the beam of my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The photo album was lying open on the coffee table. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't left it there. Slowly, I approached the table and shone the light on the album. There it was, the park photo back in its place. But something was different. The shadowy figure in the background was no longer blurry. It was sharper now, more defined. I could see the outline of a face, though it was obscured by shadows. The figure was staring directly at the camera. I slammed the album shut and backed away, my hands trembling. Every instinct told me to leave the apartment, but I couldn't bring myself to step outside in the middle of the night. Instead, I locked my bedroom door and spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed, the lights on, my phone clutched in my hand. The next day, I took the photo album to a friend's house, hoping for a rational explanation. My friend Sarah examined the photo carefully. "Maybe it's just a double exposure," she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Old cameras could be weird sometimes." I nodded, wanting to believe her, but deep down I knew something was wrong. That night, I decided to put the album away for good. I tucked it into a storage box and shoved it into the back of my closet, hoping to forget about it. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few days, I began noticing things out of place. Small items moved from where I'd left them, faint footprints on the dusty floor near the closet. And then there were the whispers. They started faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone murmuring in the next room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and insistent. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the closet. My pulse quickened as I stared at the door, which was slightly ajar. The faint glow of the hallway light spilled into the room, casting long shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the closet. My hand shook as I pushed the door open. The storage box was still there, the photo album untouched. But as I reached for it, the air around me grew cold, and a single photo slid out of the album, landing face up on the floor. It was the park photo, but this time, the shadowy figure wasn't in the background. It was standing next to me, staring directly at the camera. I fled the apartment that night, leaving everything behind. I moved in with Sarah temporarily, refusing to return even to collect my belongings. A few weeks later, the landlord called, asking if I wanted to retrieve my things. I told him to throw everything out. He hesitated before responding. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Because, there's something you should know. We found a stack of old photos in the closet. They're not yours, are they?" I hung up without answering. To this day, I can't look at old photographs without feeling a chill. The thought of that shadowy figure always watching haunts me. Some things are better left forgotten. After my recent promotion at work, I decided to move into a new apartment closer to the office. It was a modern high-rise building with all the amenities, great views, sleek interiors, and most importantly, privacy. My unit was on the top floor, quiet and secluded, just the way I liked it. The first week went by without a hitch. My days were spent at the office and my evenings were quiet. The apartment felt almost too perfect, but I figured that was just my luck. At night, the only sounds were the faint hum of the central air system and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was during the second week that things started to feel off. One night, as I was settling into bed, I heard a faint noise coming from the air vent above me. It sounded like a soft, rhythmic tapping, as if something was brushing against the metal inside. At first, I thought it might be the air system kicking in, but when I listened closer, I realized it wasn't mechanical. It was deliberate. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Perhaps a bird or a small animal had gotten into the system. But the sound continued night after night. Sometimes it was faint tapping. Other times it was a soft scraping noise that sent chills down my spine. One evening I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and a chair and climbed up to inspect the vent. When I unscrewed the cover, nothing seemed out of place. Just an empty duct leading into the darkness. I shone the flashlight into it, the beam stretching a few feet before fading into the void. "Nothing," I muttered, relieved. I replaced the cover and went about my night, but the feeling of unease lingered. A few nights later, the sounds changed. It wasn't just tapping or scraping anymore. As I lay in bed, I heard what sounded like a faint whisper. I froze, straining to hear. The voice was muffled, as though someone was speaking from far away, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced as I stared at the vent, my mind racing with possibilities. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the sounds were just the wind moving through the ducts in a strange way. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The next morning, I called the building manager to report the noises. He assured me he would have someone check the vents, but when I returned home that evening, there was no sign anyone had been there. The noises, however, continued. That night, the whispering grew louder. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Grabbing my flashlight and a screwdriver, I climbed up to the vent again. This time, I was determined to find the source. As I removed the vent cover, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, and my hands shook as I shone the flashlight into the duct. I leaned closer, peering into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A single, faint handprint, smudged and oily, pressed against the inside of the metal duct. It was too large to be mine, and the thought of someone, or something, crawling through the vents made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breathing was ragged as I stared at the handprint, trying to process what I had just seen. Without another word, I replaced the vent cover and locked myself in my bedroom, every light in the apartment blazing. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, every creak of the building sent my heart racing. By morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag and planned to spend the night at a friend's place. Before leaving, I decided to check the vent one last time. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe the handprint had some logical explanation. But when I climbed up to the vent and unscrewed the cover, the handprint was gone. Instead, in its place were words crudely scratched into the metal. "I see you." My blood ran cold as I stared at the message. My hands trembled as I reattached the cover, grabbed my bag, and ran out of the apartment without looking back. I never returned to that apartment. When I called the building manager to explain why I was breaking my lease, he sounded skeptical. "You're the second tenant to leave that unit this year," he said. "The last one complained about noises too. But we checked everything. It's just an old building." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him about the handprint or the words in the vent. Some things are better left unsaid. To this day, I can't sleep in a room with exposed vents. Every time I hear the soft hum of an air system, I remember those whispers, the handprint, and the message etched into the metal. And I wonder if whatever was in those vents is still there, waiting for the next tenant to notice. I'd been working late nights at the office for weeks, preparing for a major presentation. My company's building was an old, sprawling structure with dozens of unused rooms and hidden corners. During the day, it bustled with activity, but at night, it transformed into a quiet, cavernous maze. It was nearing midnight when I finally finished my work. As I packed up my things, the only sounds were the soft hum of the overhead lights and the occasional creak of the old pipes. My coworkers had left hours ago, leaving me as the sole occupant of the 10th floor. As I headed toward the elevators, something caught my eye, a faint light at the end of a hallway I didn't recognize. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, lined with doors on either side. I had worked in this building for 3 years and thought I knew every corner, but I had never noticed this hallway before. Curiosity got the better of me and I walked toward the light. The closer I got, the colder the air became. I told myself it was just a draft from the building's old ventilation system, but my footsteps slowed as a sense of unease crept over me. At the end of the hallway was a single door, slightly ajar, with pale light spilling out from inside. The door itself was old and weathered, unlike the modern ones throughout the rest of the building. "Hello?" I called out, half hoping no one would answer. My voice echoed faintly, but there was no response. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and bare, with a single wooden desk and an old rotary phone sitting on top. The light came from a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. Dust floated in the air, undisturbed, as though no one had entered this space in years. I stepped inside, my eyes drawn to the phone. It was black, with a coiled cord and a rotary dial that looked decades out of place in the otherwise modern office building. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't explain why. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my hand moved toward the phone, almost involuntarily. The moment my fingers brushed the receiver, it rang. The sound shattered the silence, making me jump. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. It rang again and again, the sound growing louder and more insistent. Finally, I picked it up. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, faintly, a voice emerged. It was soft, almost childlike, but distorted, as though it were coming from far away. "Why are you here?" the voice asked. I froze, unable to speak. My mouth went dry as I struggled to process the question. "Why are you here?" the voice repeated, sharper this time. I work here," I stammered. "Who is this?" The line went dead. The phone emitted a low hum before falling silent. I set the receiver down carefully, my hands shaking. Every instinct told me to leave the room, but as I turned toward the door, I heard something else. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway behind me. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. The light from the open door cast long shadows on the walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw one of them shift. The footsteps grew louder, closer, though I couldn't see anyone. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, my chest heaving. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft scratching sound, like nails running down the other side of the door. My breathing grew shallow as I scanned the room, looking for another exit. There was none. The only window was small and too high to reach, and the air felt colder now, almost suffocating. The scratching stopped, and the room fell silent again. My ears strained for any sound, but all I could hear was my own racing heartbeat. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slowly opened the door and peered into the hallway. It was empty. The light at the far end had gone out, leaving the corridor shrouded in darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow spilling out of the room behind me. My legs felt heavy as I stepped into the hallway, every shadow seeming to shift and stretch as I moved. As I neared the elevators, I heard it again, the ringing of the rotary phone, distant but clear. I turned back, staring down the hallway, but the door to the strange room was now closed. The ringing continued, echoing faintly through the building. I didn't go back. I sprinted to the elevators, my hands shaking as I jabbed the button repeatedly. When the doors finally opened, I jumped inside, pressing the ground floor button with trembling fingers. As the elevator descended, I tried to steady my breathing. I told myself it was just a prank, maybe an old phone line left connected by mistake. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When the elevator doors opened, the lobby was dark and empty. I hurried out of the building, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. The next day, I went to work as usual, though I avoided the 10th floor as much as possible. Curiosity got the better of me during lunch, and I asked the building manager about the strange hallway. He frowned, confused. "There's no hallway like that on the 10th floor," he said. "It's all open-plan offices." I insisted, describing the corridor and the room at the end, but he shook his head. "You must have been mistaken," he said. "Maybe you were just tired. I haven't seen the hallway since that night. But sometimes, late at night, when the office is quiet, I hear the faint ringing of a phone echoing through the building. And I wonder if the door at the end of the forgotten hallway is still waiting, still watching for someone else to wander too far." When I first moved into my new apartment, it seemed like a dream. It was a quiet building on a peaceful street, and the rent was surprisingly affordable. The landlord explained that most of the tenants had lived there for years, keeping to themselves. I liked the idea of a calm, low-key place to call home. The first week passed uneventfully. I spent most of my time unpacking and settling in. The only neighbor I saw regularly was an elderly man who lived across the hall. He introduced himself as Mr. Carver, a kind yet reserved man who mentioned that he'd lived in the building for over 3 decades. "I'm just across the hall if you need anything," he said with a faint smile, though his tone carried a hint of sadness. The second week, I started to notice little things about the apartment that didn't feel quite right. The floorboards creaked oddly at night, and sometimes I swore I heard faint shuffling sounds coming from the hallway, even though no one seemed to be outside. I chalked it up to the quirks of an old building and tried to ignore it. One evening as I came home from work, I noticed Mr. Carver's door was slightly ajar. The hallway was dim, the flickering overhead light casting long shadows on the walls. I hesitated for a moment before knocking gently on his door. "Mr. Carver?" I called out. There was no response. I peeked inside. The apartment was eerily quiet. The living room was neatly arranged, with old-fashioned furniture and books stacked neatly on shelves. But something felt off. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic smell. I stepped back quickly, not wanting to intrude further. The next day, I knocked on his door again to check on him. This time there was no response and the door was closed. I assumed he wasn't home and left it at that. But over the next few days, I didn't see him at all. His apartment remained silent, and the hallway felt emptier than usual. I finally decided to ask the landlord about it. "Hey," I said casually, trying not to sound nosy, "do you know if Mr. Carver's okay? I haven't seen him in a while." The landlord frowned, looking puzzled. "Mr. Carver? There hasn't been anyone living in that unit for months." My stomach dropped. "No, that's not right. I met him. He's been here every day." The landlord shook his head. "I'm telling you, the last tenant moved out 6 months ago. That unit's been empty since." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "But his door was open just a few days ago." I looked inside. "You must have been mistaken," the landlord said firmly. "It's locked. No one's been in there." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I replayed my interactions with Mr. Carver in my head, trying to make sense of it. Could I have imagined him? No, I was certain he was real. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint shuffling sound in the hallway. This time it was louder, more distinct. I crept to my door and looked through the peephole. Mr. Carver was standing there, facing my door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him. His face was pale, his expression blank, and his eyes seemed unfocused. He didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for something. "Mr. Carver?" I whispered through the door, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly and walked back toward his apartment. The door, which I was certain had been locked, creaked open to let him in, then swung shut behind him. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to confront the situation. I knocked on his door firmly, calling out his name. When there was no response, I tried the handle. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. I stepped inside cautiously. The air was thick, the metallic smell stronger than before. The living room was just as I remembered it, neat and orderly as though no one had touched it in years. But as I walked further in, I noticed something chilling. On the coffee table was a photo album. The cover was dusty and the edges were worn. I opened it, my hands shaking. The photos inside were old, black and white, showing a younger Mr. Carver standing in front of the building, smiling with a group of people. As I flipped through the pages, the photos became darker. The last few showed Mr. Carver standing alone, his expression somber, the building's windows behind him boarded up. Suddenly, I heard a sound from the bedroom, a faint creak like someone shifting their weight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed the bedroom door open. The room was empty, but the bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled as though someone had just been lying there. On the nightstand was a single, framed photograph. It showed Mr. Carver standing in the hallway, right in front of my apartment door. I stumbled back, my hands clammy, and ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in my own unit, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. That was the last time I saw Mr. Carver. A week later, I moved out, breaking my lease and leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't stay in that building, not after what I'd seen. To this day, I still wonder who, or what, Mr. Carver was. Was he a ghost tied to that building? Or was he something else, something that had been waiting in that apartment for years? Whatever the truth is, I'm just grateful I got out before I became part of his story. It was well past midnight when I finally left the bar. My friends had gone home hours earlier, but I stayed behind, nursing my last drink and staring blankly at the half-empty room. The streets were quiet as I stepped outside, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I was too tired to walk the mile back to my apartment, so I decided to call for a taxi. Within minutes, a cab pulled up to the curb. It was an older model, its paint dull and scratched, with a faint smell of mildew wafting from the cracked leather seats. The driver was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his face. "Where to?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I gave him my address, and he nodded without a word, pulling away from the curb and into the quiet streets. The city felt eerie at this hour, the usual hum of traffic replaced by an unsettling stillness. As we drove, I noticed the faint hum of the radio, playing what sounded like a static-filled oldie station. I stared out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by. But after a few minutes, something felt wrong. The route we were taking didn't seem right. Instead of heading down the main avenue, the driver had turned onto a smaller, less familiar road. The streetlights grew sparser, and the buildings gave way to industrial warehouses and empty lots. "Hey," I said, leaning forward. "This isn't the way to my place." The driver didn't respond. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale. "Excuse me," I said louder. "Where are we going?" He finally glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his tired eyes meeting mine. "Shortcut," he said simply, his tone flat. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. The radio crackled softly, the static growing louder, drowning out the faint melody. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The GPS map refused to load, leaving me staring at a blank screen. My stomach tightened as the realization hit me. I didn't know where I was, and I had no way to call for help. The road grew narrower, lined with dense trees that loomed over the car like silent sentinels. The dim glow of the headlights barely pierced the darkness ahead. I leaned forward again, trying to keep my voice steady. "Listen, this doesn't feel like a shortcut. Can you just turn around and take me back to the main road?" The driver didn't answer. Instead, he pressed harder on the gas, the engine growling as the car sped up. My heart raced as I gripped the edge of the seat. "What are you doing?" "Stop the car." He didn't stop. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, unblinking. Panic took over, and I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were engaged, and the buttons on the door wouldn't respond. "Let me out," I shouted, pounding on the glass. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened, and for the first time, I noticed his hands. They were pale and thin, the skin stretched tight over his knuckles, almost inhuman. The radio crackled again, the static rising to a deafening pitch. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. A voice came through, faint and distorted, whispering words I couldn't understand. "Who are you talking to?" I demanded, but the driver remained silent. The car took a sharp turn, the tires skidding on the gravel road. My head slammed against the window, and for a moment, my vision blurred. When I looked up, the road had changed. It wasn't a road anymore. The car was moving through a dense, fog-covered forest. The trees pressed close on either side, their twisted branches scraping against the windows. The air inside the car grew colder, my breath fogging up the glass. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, gripping the seatbelt. The driver finally spoke, his voice low and rasping. "Almost there." "Almost where?" I demanded, fear thick in my throat. He didn't answer. Suddenly, the car slowed, coming to a stop in a small clearing. The headlights illuminated a dilapidated wooden cabin, its windows dark and its door hanging ajar. "Get out," the driver said, his voice void of emotion. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm not getting out." He turned to face me for the first time. His eyes were hollow, empty socket staring into nothingness. His mouth twisted into a cruel smile, revealing jagged yellow teeth. "You don't have a choice," he hissed. Before I could react, the locks clicked and the door swung open on its own. A force I couldn't see pulled me out of the car, dragging me toward the cabin. I screamed, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the driver's face, watching from the car, his hollow eyes filled with something between amusement and hunger. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my clothes soaked from the morning dew. My phone was in my pocket, its battery dead. I looked around, but there was no sign of the car or the cabin, just an empty stretch of highway and the distant hum of traffic. I eventually made it home, but I haven't taken a taxi since. To this day, I don't know what happened that night or where the driver was taking me. But sometimes late at night, when I hear the distant rumble of a car engine, I wonder if he's still out there waiting for his next passenger. Living alone in a quiet neighborhood had always been peaceful for me. The house was small but cozy, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac. The nights were silent, save for the occasional sound of wind rustling through the trees. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and I liked it that way. That changed one night when I was jolted awake by a loud knock at the door. It was just past midnight and the neighborhood was completely still. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. My first thought was that it might be a neighbor needing help, but that seemed unlikely. I hadn't heard any cars and no one ever came by unannounced. The knock came again, harder this time, echoing through the house. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat with the hood pulled low over his face. The porch light cast harsh shadows, making it difficult to see his features. He stood completely still, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, my voice trembling slightly. There was a long pause before he responded. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low and calm. "My car broke down. I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help." Something about his tone set me on edge. It was too measured, too deliberate. I glanced at the street through the window beside the door. There was no car in sight, just the empty cul-de-sac bathed in moonlight. "I don't have a landline," I lied, clutching my phone tightly. "There's a gas station about a mile down the road. They can help you." The man didn't move. "It's cold out here," he said. "Could I just come in for a minute to warm up?" My grip on the phone tightened. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in. Please try the gas station." For a moment he was silent. Then he took a step closer to the door. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his voice now carrying a slight edge. My stomach twisted. "I'm calling the police," I said, hoping the threat would scare him off. But instead of leaving, the man stepped back, his head tilting slightly to one side as if studying me through the door. "You don't need to do that," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to come inside." I backed away, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. My eyes never left the door as I explained the situation to the operator. She assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. The man knocked again, harder this time. The sound reverberated through the house, making my skin crawl. "You really shouldn't have done that," he said, his tone darker now. I ran to the back of the house, locking the doors and windows as I went. My heart raced as I heard a new sound. Footsteps on the side of the house, moving toward the backyard. "Stay inside," the operator said. "Help is on the way." I crouched behind the couch, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The footsteps stopped near the back door, and I heard the faint rattle of the doorknob. My blood ran cold. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, like someone gently drumming their fingers against the glass. Slowly I peeked over the couch. The man was standing at the back door, his hood still hiding most of his face. But now I could see his smile, a wide, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Come on," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. Just let me in. It'll be easier that way. I ducked back behind the couch, whispering to the operator that he was at the back door. She urged me to stay hidden, her calm voice doing little to soothe my terror. The tapping stopped, and for a few seconds there was silence. Then I heard a loud crash, the sound of breaking glass. I bolted for the bathroom, locking the door behind me as I heard the man's footsteps inside the house. My hands shook as I pressed the phone to my ear, trying to stay as quiet as possible. "He's inside," I whispered. "The officers are almost there," the operator said. "Stay where you are." I could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He was searching for me, his heavy breaths audible even through the bathroom door. "Come out," he called, his voice sing-song. "I just want to talk." Tears streamed down my face as I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the bathroom. The doorknob rattled. I bit down on my hand to keep from screaming as the man chuckled softly. "I know you're in there," he said. Just then, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The man's tone changed instantly. "We'll finish this another time," he said, his voice low and cold. The footsteps retreated, and a few moments later, I heard the sound of the front door slamming. When the police arrived, they found no trace of him. The broken glass and muddy footprints were the only evidence he had been there. They assured me they would patrol the area and urged me to stay somewhere else for the night. I packed a bag and left immediately, staying with a friend while I searched for a new place to live. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget his voice, calm and chilling, or the way he smiled as he tapped on the glass. Even now, months later, I keep the doors and windows locked at all times. But no matter how secure I make my new home, I can't shake the feeling that he'll come back one day. And when he does, I won't be ready. During college, I often stayed late at the campus library to study. It was one of the few places where I could truly focus, especially at night when the building emptied out. The library was massive, its high ceilings and endless rows of books giving it a cathedral-like quality. The silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights, always helped me concentrate. One particular night, I lost track of time while working on a paper. When I glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. The library officially closed at 11 p.m., but the staff often gave a generous grace period before locking up. I packed up my things quickly and headed toward the main exit. The overhead lights had already dimmed, casting the aisles and reading tables in deep shadows. As I walked, my footsteps echoed unnaturally, louder than they should have been. When I reached the front doors, they were locked. I frowned, pulling on the handles, but they didn't budge. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I was alone, locked inside. I pulled out my phone to call campus security, but there was no signal. Frustrated, I decided to check the staff desk for a phone. The desk was empty, of course, but I noticed something odd. A single light was still on in the far corner of the library, near the restricted archives. It was faint, but it stood out in the otherwise darkened space. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. There was no response. The rational part of me wanted to stay put, to wait for someone to find me in the morning. But curiosity, or maybe unease, compelled me to investigate. I made my way toward the light, my footsteps growing softer as the carpet absorbed the sound. The restricted archives were located at the far end of the library, behind a set of heavy glass doors. Students weren't allowed in without special permission, but tonight the doors were slightly ajar. The light spilled out into the hallway like a beacon. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was colder here, and the faint smell of old paper and mildew hung in the air. The rows of shelves loomed taller than those in the main library, their contents hidden in shadows. As I moved deeper into the room, I saw the source of the light, a small desk lamp illuminating an open book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the text written in a language I didn't recognize. I reached out to close the book, but stopped when I noticed something strange. The shadows around me seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly as though they were alive. I glanced over my shoulder, but the room was empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned back to the book and froze. The text on the open pages was gone. The previously full paragraphs had disappeared, leaving the pages blank. My chest tightened as I stared at the empty paper, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. The words were unintelligible, overlapping and distorted, but they seemed to come from all around me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving the room in suffocating silence. I took a step back, my hand brushing against the edge of the desk. The book slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the room. I turned and ran, the air around me growing colder with every step. The rows of shelves seemed endless, stretching out in every direction. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't find the exit. Panic set in as the whispers returned, louder this time, almost shouting. The shadows around me twisted and writhed, forming shapes that danced along the walls. I could feel them closing in, unseen hands brushing against my arms and back. Finally, I stumbled into the main library. The whispers stopped and the air felt lighter, but the exit was still locked. Desperate, I grabbed a chair and smashed it against the glass doors. The sound shattered the silence, and the glass splintered but didn't break completely. I didn't care. I kept hitting the glass until it finally gave way. The night air rushed in and I bolted out into the empty campus, my chest heaving. When I reached my dorm, I locked the door behind me and sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. The library had always felt like a safe haven, but that night, it had become something else entirely. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion or a vivid nightmare. But when I passed the library on my way to class, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The restricted archives were closed off with yellow tape, a sign on the door reading, "Under maintenance." I asked one of the librarians about it and her face grew pale. "We've had issues in that section," she said carefully. "Strange noises, books going missing. You're lucky you weren't there after dark." I didn't press her for details. I didn't need to. To this day, I avoid libraries after closing time. The silence that once comforted me now feels oppressive, and I can't shake the feeling that something in those archives is still waiting, still watching for someone foolish enough to return. A few months ago, I rented a room in a large old house near my new job. The rent was cheap and the landlord, Mr. Grayson, seemed friendly enough. The house was divided into 3 separate units. Mine on the main floor, another upstairs, and one in the basement. On the day I moved in, I met the upstairs tenant, a quiet young woman named Claire. She mentioned she rarely saw the basement tenant. "Honestly," she said, glancing toward the basement door at the end of the hall, "I think he works nights. I've only heard him a couple of times, mostly footsteps when I'm up late." I didn't think much of it. The idea of a mysterious neighbor seemed quaint, even charming at first. The first few nights were uneventful. I settled into my routine, enjoying the peace of the quiet house. Occasionally, I'd hear faint creaks from the upstairs unit or the muffled sound of footsteps from the basement. It was comforting in a way, evidence that I wasn't alone. But soon I started noticing odd things. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock at my door. When I opened it, no one was there. I looked up and down the hallway, but it was empty. Probably just Claire, I thought, though it struck me as odd that she wouldn't wait for me to answer. The next morning I asked her about it. "It wasn't me," she said, frowning. "Are you sure you didn't imagine it?" Her response unsettled me, but I brushed it off. Old houses creak, I told myself. Sounds echo. A week later, I came home to find the door to the basement slightly ajar. I hesitated, staring into the dark stairwell. The landlord had told me the basement tenant was quiet and kept to himself, so I figured he must have forgotten to close the door. "Hello?" I called down, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. There was no response, but I thought I heard a faint shuffle, like someone moving deeper into the basement. I closed the door and locked it, feeling a strange unease settle over me. The following nights were worse. I began waking up to faint tapping sounds coming from the floor beneath my bed. It wasn't rhythmic, just sporadic enough to be unnerving. I told myself it was probably pipes or the house settling, but deep down I wasn't convinced. One night the tapping grew louder. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening as I strained to listen. The sound seemed to move, starting under the bed and then traveling toward the wall as if someone, or something, was crawling. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I confronted Mr. Grayson. "Does the basement tenant ever make noise at night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mr. Grayson's expression darkened. "The basement tenant? There hasn't been anyone in the basement for months. The last guy moved out after claiming the place was haunted." I stared at him, my mind racing. "But I hear footsteps and tapping, and I saw the door open last week." He shook his head firmly. "No one's down there. The basement's locked from the inside. It's probably just the old pipes. This house makes strange noises sometimes." I didn't believe him. That night, the tapping returned, louder than ever. This time, it wasn't just tapping. It was accompanied by faint whispers. Unable to stand it any longer, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door, heart pounding with every step. The air grew colder as I approached, and the whispering seemed to grow louder, though I couldn't make out the words. The door was unlocked. I hesitated, gripping the handle tightly before pushing it open. The stairwell stretched down into darkness, the faint smell of damp earth wafting up. I descended slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I moved. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, cluttered room. Old furniture and boxes were piled haphazardly, covered in thick layers of dust. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing a blank wall. On the floor around it were deep scratches, as though the chair had been dragged back and forth repeatedly. And then I saw the handprints. They were smeared into the dust on the wall, large and uneven, as if someone had pressed their palms against the surface over and over. My stomach churned as I took a step closer, the whispers now so faint they seemed to come from inside my own head. Suddenly, I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Nothing moved, but the shadows seemed deeper now, almost alive. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. It was tall and thin, its face obscured. "Hello?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It turned slowly and disappeared down the hall, the sound of its footsteps fading into silence. I didn't follow it. Instead, I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it and shoved a chair under the handle, my heart racing as I backed away. The next morning, I packed my things and left without looking back. I didn't tell Mr. Grayson what I had seen. What could I say? A week later, I heard from Claire. She had moved out too. I started hearing things, she admitted over the phone. Whispers, footsteps. I couldn't take it anymore. I don't know who or what was in that basement, but I've made a promise to myself. I'll never rent a place with a basement again. Some doors are meant to stay closed, no matter what's waiting on the other side. I work as a rideshare driver in a mid-sized city, a job I started to make ends meet while saving up for school. Most nights, it's uneventful, picking up passengers, making small talk, and dropping them off at their destinations. But one night, I picked up a passenger I'll never forget. It was a rainy Thursday evening and business was slow. I was about to call it a night when a new request came through. The pickup location was on the outskirts of town, near an old industrial district. I hesitated, but the fare was good, so I accepted. The streets grew quieter as I drove further from the city center. The rain blurred the streetlights, and the few pedestrians I passed seemed to vanish into the mist. The pickup location was an abandoned factory, its looming silhouette barely visible through the downpour. I pulled up to the curb, my headlights illuminating the cracked pavement. There was no one in sight. For a moment, I thought the request had been a prank. I was about to cancel the ride when I saw her, a young woman stepping out from the shadows. She was dressed in a simple white dress, soaked from the rain, her dark hair clinging to her face. I rolled down the window. "Are you Sarah?" I asked, matching the name on the app. She nodded but didn't speak. I unlocked the door and she climbed into the back seat. The air immediately felt colder, as if the rain had seeped inside with her. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the window. After a long pause, she said, "Just drive." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and it sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated but started driving, unsure of where to go. "Do you have a specific address?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She shook her head. "Just keep going. I'll tell you when to stop." The streets grew darker as I drove, the rain falling harder against the windshield. The woman sat silently, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Every so often, I glanced at her in the mirror, but her expression never changed. Something about her felt off. Her clothes looked old-fashioned, and despite the rain, they didn't seem as wet as they should have been. "Are you okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. She didn't respond right away. Then, without looking at me, she said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question caught me off guard. I'm not sure," I said cautiously. "Why do you ask?" She turned to meet my eyes in the mirror. Her gaze was piercing, her face pale and expressionless. "Sometimes they just want to go home," she said. A shiver ran down my spine and I gripped the wheel tighter. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the road ahead was barely visible. "Where's home?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the left. "Turn here." I followed her direction, turning onto a narrow, unpaved road that led into a wooded area. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. The headlights illuminated the dirt path, but the shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting as we drove. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my anxiety growing with each passing second. She didn't respond. Finally, the road ended in a small clearing. At the center stood an old, crumbling house, its windows dark and its walls covered in ivy. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible. I stared at the house, dread pooling in my stomach. "Do you want me to wait?" I asked, already knowing I didn't want to stay here any longer than necessary. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. "Hey, wait," I called after her. She walked toward the house without looking back. Her figure grew smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the shadows. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to follow her or leave. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back seat was dry. There was no sign she had ever been there. No water, no footprints, nothing. Panic set in, and I threw the car into reverse, backing out of the clearing as fast as I could. The headlights briefly illuminated the house again, and for a split second, I thought I saw her standing in one of the windows, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. When I checked the app to end the ride, the request had vanished. There was no record of it, no sign that anyone named Sarah had ever booked a ride. I told myself it was just a strange glitch or a vivid dream. But a few weeks later, I heard a story from another driver. He mentioned picking up a woman in the same area, a woman in a white dress who asked to be taken to an old house in the woods. I never drove near the industrial district again. To this day, I avoid late-night rides whenever I can. But sometimes, when the rain falls hard and the roads are empty, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there, waiting for one last ride home. I've always been meticulous about my routines. Every day after work, I take the same route home, eat dinner at the same time, and unwind by watching a movie or browsing my phone. My home is my sanctuary, and I take comfort in its familiarity. That's why the discovery I made a few weeks ago shook me to my core. It all started when I found a package on my doorstep. There was no return address, just my name written in neat black letters on the top. Curious but cautious, I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was an old VHS tape and a folded piece of paper with 2 words scrawled across it. Watch this. I don't own a VHS player. It's been years since anyone in my generation used them. But the tape intrigued me, and something about the message made it feel personal, almost urgent. That night, I borrowed an old player from a friend and set it up in my living room. When I pressed play, static filled the screen for a moment before the picture cleared. At first, it seemed like nothing more than random footage of a neighborhood. But my stomach dropped when I recognized the street. It was my street. The camera moved slowly, almost deliberately, down the sidewalk, passing familiar houses until it stopped in front of mine. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The footage was shaky, as if it had been filmed by someone holding the camera by hand. It lingered on my front door for a long moment before cutting to black. My hands trembled as I ejected the tape. I didn't know what to make of it. Who had filmed this? And why? The logical part of me wanted to believe it was just a prank, but the unease in my gut told me otherwise. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. The tape consumed my thoughts, and I decided to watch it again when I got home. This time, I noticed something I'd missed before. As the camera approached my house, the faint outline of a figure appeared in one of the upstairs windows, my bedroom window. I rewound the tape, pressing pause at just the right moment. The figure was barely visible, little more than a shadowy silhouette, but it was there. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. I lived alone. That night, I checked every lock on my doors and windows twice before going to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, another package was waiting on my doorstep. My stomach twisted as I brought it inside and opened it. This time, the box contained a second VHS tape and another note. Keep watching? I didn't want to watch it. Every instinct screamed at me to throw the tape away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slid it into the player and pressed play. The footage started where the last tape had left off. The camera was now inside my house. My living room appeared on the screen, filmed from the corner near the ceiling as if the camera had been mounted there. The shot was eerily still, capturing me sitting on the couch the previous night, oblivious to the fact that I was being recorded. I felt sick. My hands shook as I fast-forwarded through the footage. It followed me throughout the evening, eating dinner, brushing my teeth, getting into bed. The camera seemed to be everywhere, yet I never noticed it. Toward the end of the tape, the camera settled on a single shot, me sleeping in bed. The footage ran for several minutes before the screen abruptly went black. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been filming me. But how? The locks hadn't been tampered with, and I hadn't seen any signs of a break-in. The following days were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I installed new locks, added security cameras, and avoided going home after dark. But the packages kept coming. Each one contained another tape, each more unsettling than the last. One showed me at work, sitting at my desk. Another showed me grocery shopping. The final tape, the one that still haunts me, began with footage of me sitting in my living room watching one of the earlier tapes. As I watched the tape within a tape, my heart sank. The camera slowly panned away from the TV to reveal me sitting on the couch, but I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the shadowy corner of the room, just barely visible in the frame. I paused the tape, rewound, and played it again, hoping I was imagining things. But the figure was there, its outline unmistakable. I ran out of the house that night, leaving everything behind. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found no evidence of a break-in. The tapes were gone as if they'd never existed. I haven't gone back since. I've moved to a new city, installed every security measure I can think of, and try to forget what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the same uneasy sensation I felt watching those tapes, the feeling of being watched. I can't help but wonder if there's another package out there somewhere, waiting for me to find it. And if I do, will I dare to press play? I've always been a light sleeper, so moving into a new apartment was a gamble. The landlord assured me it was quiet, and for the first week it was. No loud neighbors, no cars honking outside, just peaceful silence. But then one night I heard it. It started faint, just a soft dripping sound coming from the bathroom. At first I assumed it was the faucet. I got out of bed, shuffled to the sink, and twisted the handles, making sure everything was shut tight. The dripping stopped, and I went back to bed, thinking nothing of it. But the next night it returned. This time the dripping sounded louder, more persistent. I checked the faucet again, but it was dry. I crouched by the tub, running my hand along the pipes, but I couldn't find a single drop of water. Annoyed, I went back to bed, but the sound followed me, faint and steady, echoing in the quiet. By the third night, it was driving me mad. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic drip. But something about it felt wrong. It didn't sound like water hitting porcelain or metal. It was heavier, wetter, like something thick hitting the ground. I got up again, determined to find the source. This time, I turned off the water supply to the entire apartment. The faucets were bone dry, yet the dripping continued, echoing faintly through the walls. Frustrated, I pressed my ear against the bathroom wall, hoping to pinpoint the sound. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from the pipes. It was coming from the ceiling. A chill ran down my spine as I looked up. The paint above the tub was slightly discolored, a small, dark patch spreading outward like a bruise. My landlord had mentioned the building's age, and I assumed it was a leaky pipe or some kind of water damage. I decided to call him in the morning. But that night, the dripping got worse. It was louder, heavier, and no longer rhythmic. It came in erratic bursts, sometimes stopping for minutes before resuming with renewed intensity. And now there was a smell, something faintly metallic like rust or old coins. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of water seeping through the walls, dark and sticky, pooling on the floor. I woke up drenched in sweat, the smell of metal lingering in the air. The next morning, I called my landlord, who promised to send someone to check it out. By the time the maintenance worker arrived, the dripping had stopped, and the dark spot on the ceiling had faded to a faint stain. He dismissed it as nothing serious, claiming the pipes were old but functional. For a few nights, the apartment was silent again, and I started to think I had imagined it. But on the fifth night, the dripping returned, louder than ever. This time, it wasn't confined to the bathroom. I could hear it in the bedroom, the kitchen, even the living room. It followed me, growing louder and more erratic, until it felt like the entire apartment was alive with the sound. Desperate, I grabbed a broom and poked at the ceiling in the bathroom, hoping to dislodge whatever was causing it. The drywall cracked slightly, and a dark, viscous liquid began to seep through the fissure, dripping steadily into the tub. My heart pounded as I stared at the growing puddle. It wasn't water. It was thick, dark red, and smelled coppery. Blood. I stumbled back, the broom falling from my hands. The dripping grew faster, the liquid pooling at the bottom of the tub, spreading across the floor. I ran out of the apartment, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I called the landlord, barely coherent, telling him what I had seen. He promised to come immediately. When we returned together, the bathroom was pristine. The tub was dry, the ceiling intact, and there wasn't a single drop of blood to be found. I tried to show him the crack, but it was gone. He looked at me like I was losing my mind. "You might be stressed," he said, his tone patronizing. "Old buildings make strange noises. Get some rest." I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I did some digging, searching for any history about the building. What I found made my blood run cold. Years ago, the tenant above me had vanished without a trace. Police reports suggested foul play, but no body was ever found. The case went cold, and the apartment had remained vacant ever since. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. The dripping continued every night, no matter what I did. It became a part of the apartment, a sinister presence I couldn't escape. I moved out 2 weeks later, leaving most of my belongings behind. Even now in my new apartment, I can't sleep in silence. Every creak, every faint sound makes me freeze, waiting for the first drip to begin again. When I moved into my new apartment, I was relieved to find it quiet. Living in a city, I was used to the constant sounds of traffic, loud neighbors, and occasional arguments echoing through the walls. But here, everything was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. The first few days went by without incident. I barely heard a sound from the upstairs unit, which was surprising since the landlord had mentioned it was occupied. Occasionally, I'd catch a faint shuffle of footsteps or the soft creak of the floorboards, but it was so subtle that I almost forgot anyone lived there. One evening, as I returned from work, I noticed a small package addressed to the upstairs apartment sitting on the shared mailbox shelf. It was marked for Unit 5B. Out of curiosity, I glanced at the sender, but there was no return address. Shrugging, I grabbed my own mail and headed inside. As I climbed the stairs, I decided to knock on 5B's door to deliver the package. When I reached the landing, I noticed the door. It was old, with chipped paint and a slightly rusted doorknob. There were no decorations, no welcome mat, just an empty, lifeless entrance. I knocked lightly. "Hello? Your package is here," I called out. There was no answer. I waited a few moments, then knocked again, louder this time. The faint sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from behind the door, but no one answered. After another minute of silence, I set the package down by the door and left. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the faint footsteps upstairs. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the floor. It struck me as odd, given how quiet the tenant seemed otherwise. The footsteps continued for over an hour before finally stopping. I tried to ignore it and drifted off to sleep, thinking it was just the quirks of living in an old building. Over the next week, the footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Always the same slow, deliberate pacing that started around 11 p.m. and lasted for hours. It didn't matter if I stayed up late or went to bed early, the sound always started at the same time, like clockwork. One evening, I ran into my landlord in the hallway and decided to ask about it. "Does the person upstairs work late or something? I keep hearing footsteps at night," I said casually. The landlord's face darkened slightly. "There shouldn't be anyone living in 5B right now," he said. "The last tenant moved out months ago." My stomach dropped. "But I've heard someone walking around up there," I insisted. "I even left a package by their door." He frowned, looking genuinely confused. "The unit's empty. I haven't rented it out yet. Are you sure you heard something?" I nodded, my pulse quickening. "Maybe you should check it out." He hesitated, then promised to look into it. That night, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I lay awake in bed, listening to the silence, waiting for the footsteps to start. At exactly 11 p.m. they began. This time they were louder, more forceful, as if whoever, or whatever, was upstairs wanted to make their presence known. I grabbed my phone and decided to record the sound, hoping to prove I wasn't imagining things. As I listened, a new sound joined the footsteps. A soft dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My skin prickled with fear. I turned on the recording app on my phone and tiptoed toward the ceiling, holding my breath as I aimed the microphone upward. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear. Then, from directly above me, came a loud, deliberate knock. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The knock was followed by another, then another, echoing through the room like a challenge. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. He answered groggily, clearly annoyed by the late call, but agreed to come over. By the time he arrived, the noises had stopped. I followed him upstairs, my hands shaking as he unlocked the door to 5B. The apartment was empty. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed except for a few faint footprints leading from the door to the center of the room. The air inside was stale and cold, as if the space had been abandoned for years. "I told you," the landlord said, his voice uneasy. "No one's here." I pointed to the footprints. "Then what's that?" He didn't have an answer. He just muttered something about old pipes and promised to have a contractor look at the building. That night I didn't sleep. The next morning I decided to investigate. I knocked on the doors of the other tenants, asking if they'd heard anything strange from 5B. Most of them looked at me like I was crazy, but one older woman, Mrs. Alvarez, pulled me aside. "You shouldn't ask about 5B, she whispered. "Bad things happen there." I pressed her for details, and she reluctantly told me about a tenant who had lived there years ago. A man who was rarely seen, who kept to himself and was rumored to have a violent past. One day he disappeared without a trace. The landlord at the time claimed he had moved out, but some of the tenants believed otherwise. "They say his ghost is still there," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice trembling. I laughed nervously, but her words stayed with me. That night, as I lay in bed, the footsteps returned, louder than ever. This time they didn't stop at the usual pacing. Instead, they moved down the hallway, stopping directly above my bedroom. I stared at the ceiling, too scared to move, as the sound of heavy breathing joined the footsteps. I moved out the next day. To this day, I don't know what was in 5B, and I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, I swear I still hear those footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. When I first moved into my small rental house, I was thrilled. It was old, sure, but it had charm: arched doorways, wooden floors, and a cozy little kitchen. The landlord had been upfront about the quirks. The pipes groaned on cold mornings, and some of the windows didn't open properly. None of it bothered me. It felt like a fresh start. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I unpacked, settled in, and made the house my own. But then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a slightly musty odor that I assumed was just the age of the house. I cleaned obsessively, scrubbing every corner and airing out the rooms, but the smell lingered. It wasn't constant. It would appear suddenly, a sharp, acrid scent that seemed to move from room to room. One night, as I was sitting in the living room, the smell grew stronger, almost overwhelming. It was sharp and metallic, like rusted iron mixed with something sour. I checked the kitchen, thinking maybe something had gone bad in the fridge, but everything was fine. I even crawled under the sink to check for leaks, but found nothing. That night, I dreamed of the smell. In my dream, it wasn't just a scent, but a presence, thick and suffocating, pressing against my chest. I woke up gasping, the air in my room heavy with the same acrid stench. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, I called the landlord. "It's probably just the pipes," he said dismissively. "Old houses get smells sometimes. You'll get used to it." But I couldn't get used to it. The smell wasn't just a nuisance. It felt alive, almost intentional. A week later, I came home from work to find the house filled with the scent. It was so strong that my eyes watered as I stepped inside. I opened all the windows and doors, but the smell seemed to cling to the walls. Desperate, I followed it, sniffing the air like some deranged bloodhound. It led me to the hallway closet. The smell was strongest there, practically oozing out from behind the closed door. My hand hesitated on the doorknob as a chill ran down my spine. Finally, I steeled myself and pulled it open. The closet was empty, just a few hangers swinging gently from the rod. But the smell hit me like a wave, so strong that I gagged. I stepped back, my flashlight catching something on the back wall, a small, square panel I hadn't noticed before. It was an access panel, barely big enough for a person to fit through. The edges were scratched and worn, as though it had been opened and closed repeatedly. My gut told me not to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a screwdriver and pried it open. The smell was unbearable now, a mix of rotting meat and sour decay. Behind the panel was a dark, narrow crawl space that seemed to stretch deep into the walls of the house. I shone my flashlight inside, half expecting to see rats or some other pest. What I saw was worse. A pair of eyes stared back at me. They blinked once, slowly, before disappearing into the darkness. I slammed the panel shut and stumbled back, my heart racing. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the screwdriver. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, clutching my phone like a lifeline. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? That I smelled something strange and saw, what? An animal? A person? The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I told the landlord I had an emergency and couldn't stay, but I didn't explain further. A week later, I drove by the house out of curiosity. The windows were dark and the driveway was empty. As I slowed down, I noticed the landlord standing on the front lawn, talking to a man in a suit. I rolled down the window. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The landlord frowned. "I had to call an inspector," he said. "The new tenant complained about a smell." My blood ran cold. "Did they find anything?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing conclusive. Just some unusual markings in the crawl space. Probably animals." I nodded and drove away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just animals. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't natural. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I swear I can still smell it. That sharp, metallic scent, lingering just on the edge of memory. When I moved into my new apartment, I loved everything about it. The cozy space, the quiet neighborhood, and the modern security features. The deadbolt lock on the door gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt in years, especially since I lived alone. I developed a ritual of triple-checking the locks every night before bed. It wasn't paranoia, just peace of mind. Or so I thought. It started about a month after I moved in. One night, I woke up to a chill and found my front door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stared at the dark hallway beyond. I knew I had locked the door before bed. I always did. The deadbolt was still extended, yet the door was open as if someone had pushed it hard enough to bypass the lock. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. By morning, I convinced myself I'd made a mistake. Maybe I hadn't locked the door properly after all. To be safe, I replaced the lock that day, upgrading to one with reinforced security. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, I heard the faint creak of the door opening. I bolted upright in bed, adrenaline coursing through me. The room was silent except for the faint hum of my refrigerator. I crept into the living room and there it was, my front door slightly ajar. I turned on all the lights and searched the apartment. Nothing was missing and no one seemed to be inside. My new lock showed no signs of tampering. My hands trembled as I secured the door again, this time jamming a chair under the handle for good measure. The next morning, I called my landlord. "Has anyone reported problems with their doors?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sounded annoyed. "No, and those locks are sturdy. Maybe you're forgetting to close it all the way." I wanted to argue, but I let it go. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next week, I started noticing small, unsettling details. A glass on the counter I didn't remember using. A chair slightly out of place. My keys moved from the hook by the door to the coffee table. Each time I tried to rationalize it. I must have been careless. I must have moved these things myself. But deep down, I knew better. One night, I decided to set a trap. I bought a cheap security camera and mounted it discreetly in the living room facing the door. If someone was getting in, I'd catch them. That night, I triple-checked the locks and pushed the chair under the doorknob. Then I went to bed, my stomach churning with unease. The next morning, I checked the footage. At first, everything looked normal. The living room was empty, the door still shut. But around 3:17 a.m., the door handle twitched. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the door creaked open. The chair blocking the door didn't budge, but the door swung open just enough to reveal a dark sliver of the hallway beyond. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. No one was there. I rewound the footage, watching it frame by frame. The handle moved on its own, the door opening as if by some unseen force. I told myself it must be a mechanical issue, something wrong with the lock. But then I noticed something else. A shadow. It moved across the wall, just outside the range of the camera, as though someone had been standing in the hallway waiting. I shut off the footage, my chest tight with fear. I called the police that afternoon, reporting the strange occurrences. They arrived quickly and inspected the apartment. The locks were secure, the windows undisturbed. No sign of forced entry, the officer said, shrugging. Could be a prank. Someone might have a spare key. A spare key. The idea chilled me. My landlord had assured me the locks were changed before I moved in, but what if someone still had access? That evening, I went to confront him. He seemed surprised by my accusation. No one else has a key, he said firmly. I changed the locks myself. Maybe it's just an old building settling. I didn't believe him, but I didn't press further. I left his office, my mind racing. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light on, clutching my phone and watching the door. At 3:14 a.m., the door handle twitched again. This time I didn't wait. I ran to the door and yanked it open, my heart hammering. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights. But at my feet, just outside the door, was a folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a single sentence written in messy, hurried letters. I was here before you. I moved out the next day. I never found out who or what had been opening my door. I never found out who wrote that note. But even now, in my new apartment with its brand new locks, I can't help but wake up in the middle of the night, staring at my front door, waiting for the handle to move. Camping alone was supposed to be my escape. After months of stress at work and endless notifications, I craved silence, solitude, and the simplicity of nature. I picked a remote national forest miles from the nearest town and drove out on a Friday afternoon with a tent, a small cooler, and my trusty flashlight. The first evening was everything I'd hoped for. I set up camp in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, started a fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. As the sun set, the woods grew darker and quieter, the only light coming from my fire. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the crackling embers outside. But at some point during the night, I woke up. It was the kind of awakening where you're not sure what disturbed you. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling, not even the distant hoot of an owl. My little campsite felt unnervingly still. Then I heard it. A faint crunch like footsteps coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was slow and deliberate, growing louder as it approached. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on, afraid of revealing my location. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. I thought I heard faint breathing, but it could have been the blood rushing in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the sound faded away, retreating into the woods. I waited another hour before I dared peek out. The campfire had died and the clearing was empty. I convinced myself it must have been an animal, a deer maybe. I fell asleep again just before dawn, clutching the flashlight tightly in my hand. The next morning, I inspected the area around my tent. Sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt, not hoof prints but human-sized and barefoot. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe it was another camper passing by, I told myself. A coincidence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I spent the day hiking and gathering wood. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping the bright flames would keep anything or anyone away. As darkness fell, I couldn't relax. Every crackle of the fire made me jump, and I found myself constantly scanning the tree. Hours passed without incident, and I finally crawled into my tent, exhausted. I woke again to the sound of footsteps. This time they weren't faint or distant. They were heavy, purposeful, and circling my tent. My throat went dry as I listened to the slow, deliberate pacing. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing, just the empty clearing and the flickering remains of the fire. But the footsteps continued. They weren't coming from the ground. They were above me. I looked up and froze. A figure stood on a low-hanging tree branch just outside the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person standing perfectly still, watching. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it toward the figure. The moment the light touched the branch, they dropped to the ground and disappeared into the shadows. I scrambled back into the tent, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed up my campsite in record time. As I shoved the last of my gear into the car, I glanced back at the clearing. That's when I saw it. A pile of rocks near the extinguished fire pit, arranged carefully in a circle. In the center was a single, weathered feather. I drove out of the forest without looking back, my heart still pounding. To this day, I don't know who or what was in the woods with me, but I haven't been camping alone since. The silence I once craved now feels like a warning, a reminder of how small and vulnerable we are when we're truly alone. Working late wasn't unusual for me. The office was quiet after hours, and I found it easier to focus without the constant buzz of chatter and ringing phones. On most nights, it was just me and a handful of other people burning the midnight oil. One night, I noticed something strange. My coworker, Emily, who usually sat a few desks over, hadn't been at her desk all day. Her chair was empty, her computer monitor dark. It wasn't like her to miss work without a word. Emily was the kind of person who sent overly detailed emails even if she was running 5 minutes late. By 8 p.m., I was one of the last people left in the office. The cleaning crew had already come through, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of the building settling. Out of curiosity, I wandered over to Emily's desk. It looked unusually tidy, almost as if she had cleaned it before leaving. Her coffee mug was washed and placed neatly on a coaster, her pens arranged in a perfect row. Even her sticky notes, normally plastered all over her monitor, were gone. But her computer was still on. The screen displayed an open email draft, addressed to no one. The subject line read, "Help." I frowned, my stomach tightening. The body of the email was blank, and the cursor blinked expectantly in the middle of the screen. Maybe she'd left in a hurry, I thought. Maybe something came up. But why would she start an email like that and not finish it? The unease lingered as I returned to my desk and tried to focus on my work. The minutes ticked by, and the office grew quieter, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Around 9 p.m. I heard it, a faint buzzing sound. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, cutting through the stillness. I followed the sound to the supply closet. The door was slightly ajar, and the buzzing grew louder as I approached. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. There was no response. I pushed the door open. The overhead light flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows across the shelves. On the floor, partially hidden beneath a pile of papers, was Emily's phone. My heart sank as I picked it up. The screen was cracked and the battery was dead. What was her phone doing here? Had she dropped it? Why hadn't she come back for it? I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that there was a simple explanation. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The papers scattered on the floor weren't just random printouts. They were photocopies of Emily's ID badge, over and over again, as if someone had been running the same document through the copier repeatedly. I backed out of the closet, suddenly feeling very exposed. The dim office lights seemed to stretch the shadows farther than they should, and every sound, my footsteps, the creak of the floor, felt amplified. I decided to check the security footage. Our building had cameras in every hallway and common area, and I figured it would at least give me an idea of when Emily had left. The security room was down a dark corridor, past the break room. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The air felt heavier here, like I was being watched. The room was small and cramped, filled with monitors displaying grainy feeds of the office. I rewound the footage for Emily's desk, watching as the day played out in reverse. There she was, sitting at her desk, typing away. The timestamp showed 9:32 a.m. I fast-forwarded. She stood up around 9:45, grabbed her phone, and walked out of frame. That was the last time she appeared. I switched to the hallway camera. Emily walked toward the supply closet at 9:47, her phone in hand. She hesitated at the door, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. And then, nothing. She never came back out. I checked every angle, every hallway, but there was no sign of her leaving. It was as if she had vanished. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the empty hallway on the monitor. I called building security, explaining what I'd found. 2 guards arrived within minutes, their radios crackling as they walked through the office with me. We checked the supply closet together, but it was just as I'd left it. Papers on the floor, Emily's phone, nothing else. Maybe she left through another exit, one of the guards suggested, though his tone didn't sound confident. But she couldn't have. The front doors were the only way in or out after hours, and the cameras covered every angle. They took a report and told me they'd follow up with management, but their reassurances felt hollow. As they left, one of them muttered something to the other, just loud enough for me to hear. "She's not the first." I froze. "What do you mean?" The guard looked uncomfortable. "A few people have disappeared from this building over the years," he said reluctantly. "Always late at night. No one knows why. I didn't sleep that night." The next morning, the office was buzzing with rumors. Emily hadn't shown up at home, and her family was filing a missing persons report. Her desk remained untouched, her email still open, the subject line blinking accusingly, "Help." A week later, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay in that building, not after what I'd seen, or hadn't seen. Emily was never found. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint buzzing of a phone, as if it's still waiting for someone to pick it up. Buying my first home was supposed to be a dream come true. It was a modest house, built in the 1960s, with creaky wooden floors and plenty of character. The basement, though unfinished, seemed perfect for storage. When the realtor mentioned that the previous owner had used it sparingly, I didn't think much of it. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. The house had its quirks, pipes that groaned in the morning, floorboards that creaked with the slightest breeze, but nothing unusual. That changed one night when I was unpacking boxes in the basement. I was stacking some old books when I noticed a vent cover on the far wall. It was small, about a foot square, and partially obscured by shadows. It looked out of place, with screws that didn't match the rest of the house's fixtures. Curious, I crouched down to inspect it. The screws had been recently tampered with, and the edges of the vent were scratched and dirty. The metal felt cold, as though air was flowing through it from somewhere deep in the house. I made a mental note to ask a contractor about it and went back upstairs, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A week later, I started hearing noises. It began as faint shuffling sounds, like the scurrying of small animals, coming from the basement at night. I chalked it up to mice or maybe even raccoons finding a way in through the old foundation. But one night as I lay in bed, the sound changed. Instead of scurrying, I heard something heavier, a soft thud like a footstep. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound came again, deliberate and measured, moving across the basement floor. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom, the basement was silent. I scanned the room, the flashlight beam catching the dusty surfaces of boxes and old furniture. Everything was where it should be, but the vent on the far wall looked different. The screws were gone and the cover hung slightly ajar. My stomach churned. I approached the vent cautiously, my pulse racing. Peering inside, I could see a dark, narrow space that extended further than I expected. It looked more like a crawl space, but something about it felt wrong, too deep, too wide. I decided to call a pest control service the next day, convincing myself it was just an animal. But the sounds didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the shuffling grew louder, and sometimes I heard faint whispers, indistinct murmurs that sent chills down my spine. One evening, I found a candy wrapper on the basement floor, one I hadn't put there. The next night, I heard a thud so loud it shook the floor beneath me. Grabbing a kitchen knife, I rushed to the basement door. This time, I wasn't alone. As I flicked on the basement light, I caught a glimpse of movement near the vent. A figure, human, scrambled back into the opening, disappearing into the darkness. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The vent cover lay on the floor, bent and scratched, and the sound of rapid breathing echoed from within the crawl space. Finally, I slammed the door shut and called the police. When they arrived, the officers searched the basement, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. They found the vent opening but couldn't see much inside. After some deliberation, they pried the opening wider and crawled in. What they discovered still haunts me. The crawlspace wasn't just a vent. It was a hidden passageway leading to a small, makeshift room. Inside were blankets, empty food containers, and a pile of clothes. Someone had been living there, sneaking in and out through the vent. The officers searched the surrounding area but found no one. Whoever had been in my basement was long gone, but the thought of them watching me moving through my house while I slept was unbearable. The next day, I had the crawl space sealed and reinforced, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. I moved out a month later, selling the house at a loss just to get away. To this day, I still wonder how long they'd been there. Had they been living in the house before I moved in, watching me from the shadows? And more importantly, where did they go when they left? Some nights, when the house is too quiet, I find myself listening for that faint shuffling sound, wondering if they ever really left at all. When I moved into my new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I was excited to leave the noise and chaos of the city behind. The streets were lined with neat lawns, kids played outside, and the neighbors were friendly enough. It was exactly the kind of peaceful environment I had been searching for. The house next to mine belonged to a man named Mr. Thompson. He was a tall, gruff man in his late 50s who mostly kept to himself. The first time we spoke, he mentioned his dog, a large breed he claimed was a little shy and didn't like strangers. I thought nothing of it at first. I'd occasionally hear low growls or scratching sounds coming from his backyard, but I figured it was normal. I never actually saw the dog though, until one night. It was around 11 p.m., and I was sitting on my back porch enjoying the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet, and the only light came from a few scattered porch lamps. That's when I heard it, a deep, guttural growl coming from Mr. Thompson's yard. It was louder than any dog I'd ever heard, almost unnatural. Curious, I leaned over the fence separating our yards and tried to catch a glimpse of the animal. The backyard was mostly dark, but I could just make out a massive shadow pacing near the edge of the property. The figure was huge, far too large to be any dog I was familiar with. Its movements were slow and deliberate, and the way it carried itself sent a shiver down my spine. I called out, "Hey boy." The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with an unsettling swiftness, the figure darted toward the house, disappearing from view. The next morning, I ran into Mr. Thompson while taking out the trash. "Your dog's huge," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "What breed is he?" Mr. Thompson gave me a long, measured look. "He's special," he said curtly before turning back toward his house. His vague response left me uneasy, but I decided not to press further. Over the next few weeks, the noises from his backyard became more frequent. Low growls, heavy footsteps, and occasional loud thuds in the middle of the night. I started noticing other strange things too, like how Mr. Thompson never walked the dog, or how his backyard gate was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. One night, I woke up to a loud crash. I looked out my bedroom window and saw that the chain on Mr. Thompson's gate had broken. The gate swung open, creaking in the wind. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. My heart pounded as I shone the beam into his backyard. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, just beyond the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement. The figure was there again, its massive form illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight. It was hunched over, its broad back rising and falling with each breath. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. The figure turned its head toward me and my blood ran cold. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing eerily in the darkness. And its face, it wasn't quite right. It looked almost human, but stretched and distorted, with sharp features that didn't belong on any animal. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. By the time I picked it up, the figure was gone. The next day, I confronted Mr. Thompson. "I think your dog got out last night," I said, trying to sound calm. "I saw something in the woods behind your house." Mr. Thompson's face darkened. "You didn't see anything," he said firmly. "But..." He stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "Stay out of my business. And stay out of my yard." His reaction rattled me, but I couldn't let it go. That night, I stayed up, watching his backyard from my second-floor window. Around midnight, I saw him emerge from his house with a large slab of raw meat. He walked to the edge of the yard, near the woods, and set the meat down. Then he whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed in the still night. The figure appeared again, slinking out from the shadows. It moved toward the meat, its movements eerily smooth. Mr. Thompson stood nearby, watching silently. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I called animal control, reporting an aggressive dog. I didn't tell them what I had actually seen. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. When they arrived, Mr. Thompson was furious. He refused to let them into his backyard, shouting about property rights and harassment. The officers eventually left, warning me not to waste their time again. That night, the noises were louder than ever. Growls, snarls, and heavy footsteps echoed through the neighborhood, as if the thing in Mr. Thompson's yard was angry. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found deep scratch marks on the fence separating our yards. They were too large and too deep to have been made by any dog. I moved out 2 weeks later. I don't know what Mr. Thompson was keeping in his backyard, and I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, I think I hear that low growl, distant but unmistakable, like it's still out there waiting. It had been another long day at the office. By the time I left work, it was almost 11 p.m., and the rain had started pouring down in thick sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of water. My car was parked in the underground garage beneath the office building, a place that always felt unnervingly empty at night. Most of my coworkers had already left hours earlier, and I was one of the last to leave. The parking garage was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting harsh, flickering shadows across the damp concrete floor. I could hear the steady drip of water leaking from somewhere above, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent space. As I descended the final flight of stairs to the garage, the heavy steel door behind me creaked shut with a resounding clang, leaving me alone in the dimly lit cavern. I quickened my pace, the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. The garage was nearly empty, with only a handful of cars left scattered among the rows. The only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional hiss of water dripping onto the concrete. As I reached my car, I heard it, a faint shuffling noise coming from somewhere deeper in the garage. I paused, listening. At first, I thought it might just be the wind or the water, but then it came again, a soft, deliberate scrape like someone dragging their feet. I turned, shining my phone's flashlight into the darkness, but the beam only illuminated row after row of empty parking spaces. I shook off the feeling of unease and unlocked my car. But just as I opened the door, the overhead lights flickered, plunging the garage into darkness for a brief moment. When the lights came back on, I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart behind one of the concrete pillars. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the spot where the shadow had been, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and seeing things. But as I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I started the engine and turned on the headlights, flooding the garage with light. For a moment, everything seemed normal, just wet concrete and darkened walls. But as I was about to pull out of my parking space, I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the garage, half hidden behind a pillar. They were too far away to make out any details, but I could see the faint outline of someone watching me. I blinked and they were gone. A cold chill ran down my spine. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was definitely down here with me. I reversed out of my spot, trying to keep my eyes on where I had seen the figure, but they had disappeared completely. The garage was empty again, just the steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of rain pounding against the concrete walls. As I drove toward the exit ramp, I glanced in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw it, a figure emerging from behind one of the parked cars, walking slowly toward me. The headlights only caught glimpses of them as they moved in and out of the shadows, but I could see enough to know they were getting closer. Panicking, I sped up, the tires screeching on the wet concrete as I turned sharply toward the exit. But as I rounded the corner, the garage lights flickered again, and for a split second, everything went dark. When they came back on, the figure was gone, as if they had vanished into thin air. I thought I was in the clear as I approached the gate, but the exit barrier wouldn't lift. The sensor wasn't picking up my car, and I could hear the rain growing louder as it pounded against the metal gate. I fumbled with my access card, trying to swipe it again, but my hands were shaking too much. The feeling of being watched was almost suffocating now, the air thick with tension. Then, in the side mirror, I saw movement. The figure was back, this time closer, emerging from behind another car. I could see them more clearly now, a tall silhouette, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. They were walking faster, their footsteps echoing loudly in the cavernous space. I slammed the gas pedal, ramming the barrier gate, which splintered under the force, and sped out into the rainy night. As I merged onto the main road, my heart was racing, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they hurt. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the figure chasing me down the highway. But the road behind me was empty, just the endless sheets of rain and the distant glow of streetlights. I drove for miles, not daring to stop until I reached a well-lit gas station on the outskirts of town. I pulled into a parking spot, turned off the engine, and tried to steady my breathing. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the soft patter on the roof now almost soothing. I told myself it was over, that I had escaped whoever, or whatever, had been in that garage. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something chilling. There were wet footprints leading from the back of my car, trailing off into the darkness beyond the gas station. The prints were large, too large to be mine, and they were still fresh, glistening in the dim light. I quickly locked the doors and got back into my car, my mind racing. I didn't see anyone around, but the sense of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. The darkness beyond the gas station seemed to press in on all sides, the rain-soaked night hiding whatever might be lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I drove home as quickly as I could, the feeling of dread lingering long after I had locked myself inside my apartment. I tried to convince myself it was just some prank, maybe a homeless person seeking shelter in the garage. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Now, every time I drive into an underground parking garage, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The echo of footsteps, the flicker of the lights, the shadows that move just out of sight, it all comes rushing back. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear the faintest sound of footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate, like someone is waiting for me to open it. I never stay in the parking garage after dark anymore, but I know that one day I might not be able to escape so easily. It was just past midnight and I was driving back home after a long day at work. The highway was nearly empty, with only the occasional flash of headlights from passing trucks. The fuel gauge on my car was dangerously close to empty, and the neon sign for a gas station up ahead felt like a lifeline. I pulled off the highway and into the dimly lit lot, relieved to see the pumps still operational. The gas station looked like it hadn't been updated in years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, flickering glow on the cracked pavement. There was no attendant in sight, just the faint hum of the night and the rhythmic ticking of the overhead sign swinging in the wind. I parked next to one of the pumps and got out of the car, the air heavy with the scent of gasoline and rain-soaked asphalt. As I began filling up my tank, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. The only sound was the soft hiss of fuel flowing into my car. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life in the convenience store behind the glass windows. It was just me and the darkness beyond the circle of flickering lights. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned quickly, but all I could see were shadows shifting at the edge of the parking lot. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks. I turned back to the pump, willing it to finish faster. As I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced toward the convenience store, hoping to see someone inside, maybe an attendant who could give me some reassurance. But the store was dark, its shelves lined with dusty products that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently with a faint creak. I finished filling up, but just as I was about to get back into my car, I heard a noise. It was soft at first, like the shuffling of feet on gravel, but it was getting closer. I turned, my pulse racing, and saw a figure standing near the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could see them slowly moving toward me. Panic set in. I hurriedly replaced the fuel nozzle and tried to start my car, but the engine sputtered and refused to turn over. I cursed under my breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The figure was closer now, their pace slow but deliberate, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. Finally, the engine roared to life and I sped out of the lot, my tires screeching on the wet pavement. In my rearview mirror, I could see the figure standing in the middle of the road, their face hidden in shadow. But just as I thought I was in the clear, the car jolted violently, the dashboard lights flickering. The fuel gauge, which had just read full, was now suddenly empty again. I pulled over to the side of the road, heart pounding. The highway was completely deserted, the only light coming from my flickering headlights. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. My phone was useless. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof of the car, and in the distance I saw headlights approaching. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was another driver who could help. But as the car drew closer, I realized it wasn't just any car. It was the same old beat-up truck that had been parked at the gas station when I arrived. I hadn't noticed it earlier in my panic, but now it was unmistakable, its rusty grille and cracked headlights looming closer. I turned off my headlights and ducked down, hoping whoever was driving the truck wouldn't see me. The truck slowed as it approached, its engine rumbling like a growl in the night. I held my breath, praying it would pass by, but instead it stopped right next to my car. The rain was pounding so hard now that I could barely see through the windshield, but I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone getting out of the truck. Heavy footsteps splashed through the puddles, approaching my car slowly. I locked the doors, my hands trembling, and waited, my heart thundering in my chest. A loud bang echoed through the car as something heavy struck the rear window. I screamed, instinctively ducking down as the glass cracked but didn't shatter. I could hear the sound of metal scraping against metal, as if someone was trying to pry open the door. Desperation took over, and I turned the key in the ignition again. This time the engine sputtered to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires slipping on the wet road as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the highway, illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. They didn't chase me, they just stood there watching as I disappeared into the night. I drove for miles without looking back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of the next town, the safety of a crowded gas station with people and cameras everywhere. Only then did I dare to check the back of my car. The rear window was shattered, glass littering the back seat, and deep scratches ran along the side of the car, as if someone had clawed at it with metal tools. I couldn't explain what had happened, and the local police didn't seem to believe me. They found nothing unusual when they checked the old gas station, claiming it had been closed for years. Now, every time I drive late at night, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that old truck again. And sometimes, when the rain falls hard and the roads are empty, I swear I see those flickering lights in the distance slowly getting closer. I avoid stopping at gas stations late at night now, especially those lonely, forgotten ones off the highway, because I know that whoever, or whatever, was stalking me that night is still out there, waiting for the next stranded traveler. Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end, it really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.